Everyone on silent? Tēnā tātou, nei rā tēnei tata, ko huhi mai nei tēnei ata. Te tuatahi me tukumihi atu ki a Daisy, me tōna whānau, i tōna whiturangatia, haere o te atu. Whakaaro hoki ki te whānau o Councillor McIntyre, te wehenga o tō tā koutou whaini I tēnei ata. So just a huge mihi to all of those who have come this morning. I'm acknowledging the passing of Councillor Lean, and also our whakaaro goes to Councillor McIntyre and his family as they grieve the loss of their mother in recent weeks. So, tēnā tātou katoa. We have delegations who have come to visit with us this morning and to speak to us in an open forum. I'd like to first, if I may, just do a little bit of scene setting and acknowledge that on our agenda today we have items that are of huge and significant interest to our communities, which have been in the arena, in Taranaki's arena, for many, many years now. So just acknowledging all of those who have been involved in this kaupapa in all ways, shapes and forms, and looking forward to hearing the kōrero today. So in saying that, I'd like to invite Fiona from Protect Our Moana Taranaki. She's available. Kia ora, Fiona, you have 5 minutes, and then we'll spend 5 minutes with you for any questions if there are any. So you can take a seat. Oh, Peter's giving up.
Yeah, I just wonder if I could stand somewhere so I'm not giving my back to everybody.
Benita, why don't you move the lectern?
Am I?
Would you like, Fiona, would you like to use the lectern? Would you like the lectern?
Sure, perhaps that's easier, yeah. Excuse me, that's my first time speaking at Regional Council.
Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I stand here representative of what appears to be, quite clearly, the majority within our communities opposing seabed mining. Up and down the west coast, just this most recently on Sunday, we had more than 1,200 people braving the cold to come to paddle out events on World Oceans Day with a statement also of opposition to seabed mining. All the way from Taranaki down in Wellington, Whanganui, Pātea, Ngā Motu New Plymouth at East End Beach, where we had nearly close to 600 people, and then also up in Raglan, Port Waikato, Muriwai, up to Tahiti as well. West Coast communities are united because this would have a detrimental effect of setting a precedent if it were to be given a green light that would impact all other West Coast as well as the Pacific with our Tahitian and others that we're activating over there. So it is a broad stretch of community that are caring about this, and that includes a farming community, businesses, tangata whenua, tangata moana, fishers, surfers, youth, environmental groups, and other councils such as the South Taranaki District Council and the Taranaki Regional Council. We hope you come on. Whanganui. So some key points I'd like to make is that the local government has a mandate to protect Te Taiao, our environment, and the purpose is, under that Local Government Act, is to enable democratic decision making and promote the social, economic, environmental and cultural wellbeing of our communities now and in the future. Opposing seabed mining directly aligns with your statutory duty to protect ecosystems and coastal waters and for the interests of future generations. The areas that would within your direct responsibility would be harmed, and there is no safeguard with no accurate kind of modelling that can really portray what will actually happen. So it would be irresponsible knowing that there could be this harm to allow it to go forth. So we are asking of the TRC to come towards an opposition of seabed mining and be part of a regional response to oppose seabed mining. The environmental risks are too high. Sediment plumes, noise pollution, the ecological disturbance would threaten indigenous and endangered species, fisheries, and the health of marine ecosystems that you are mandated to protect and have responsibility to. Being neutral is not an option when you have a duty by which to uphold the care of our ecosystems and the well-being of our communities as well with it. Once the seabed is disturbed, there is no going back. This is experimental mining with no precedent for safe practice in Aotearoa or globally, and indeed it would set a very dangerous precedent if it were to go ahead, and it would also harm so many factors. And looking at the economy, what about tourism? What does it do to mar the reputation of Aotearoa New Zealand if we were to have seabed mining, the first in the world, here off our coast? I think they need to be also considered, Tourism New Zealand, as an interested party in this as well. This is a new experimental extractive industry that has no place in our moana, no place in our oceans. The oceans need protection and regeneration, not more harm. Local communities and councils are already opposed, as I've already stated, and there are more than 3,000 people that have signed a petition that has already been submitted to the New Plymouth District Council and also the Wanganui Council and the South Taranaki District Council. As South Taranaki District Council have stated, environmental vandalism, it would not be worth the gain economically for this irreversible damage. We need the leadership of TRC to step up and be of integrity with the care of our natural world and reflect the voices of your people. This is, the time is now, this fast track is moving fast, and it's also a very unjust and biased process. As we've also seen what's just happened to Te Pāti Māori with certain biases in the House, this is also the theme that is current with this Fast Track Approvals Act, whereby what comes through the panel then has 3 ministers that have clearly voiced bias and conflict of interest that would then be set to be the decision makers. So that as well, and the Fast Track process itself needs to be called out. And with that, it is clear from speaking with people who've been part of Fast Track panels from our local community leadership that it is a very unjust process that also sets a dangerous precedent for not listening to local communities and local leadership, but bypassing that for the benefit of big corporations that don't have connection to here to be able to come and take what they want, leave a mess, and take all the profits with it, because the economic value is so minor to anything that would be far superseded by the incredible harm to the community's well-being. Just imagine the stress. We're already having to come through this after 15 years of this being a threat. South Taranaki has done very well to fend off the seabed miners, and now it's been this backdoor entry. We need to be united as a region to step up and protect our moana. So thank you very much for having me be here to speak. Again, I know I speak on behalf of many, and we ask for TRC to take a strong, bold stance to oppose seabed mining. Tēnā tātou, tēnā tātou, tēnā tātou.
Kia ora, Fiona. If you'd just like to stay there, we'll just see if anyone has any part-time. Celine?
Kia ora e hoa. I'm concerned that you are urging us to take a stance as a council to oppose seabed mining, because we are in the privileged and lucky position where this organisation is going to be possibly or even probably one of the very few that get to submit to the hearing panel. Now, if we as a group in this room move a motion to oppose seabed mining, that will create a conflict of interest, and we will be immediately struck off that hearing panel, which gives us no voice. So how do you feel about the possibility of that happening if we move a motion to oppose seabed mining?
Yeah, well, that does feel quite an unjust part of the process, isn't it, Ben? And a tricky thing to navigate. All I can say is that there is strength in a united regional opposition to this, and so I stand by that it is necessary to uphold integrity of the care that is the role of the TRC to be part of a united stance.
So you would be happy to do that for us to jeopardise the opportunity to be able to provide feedback to the fast track process?
So I'd say that the more of the guidance around all of that sits with those that have more of the legal understanding, and that would be out of my ability to recommend more deeply on that. But my understanding is that it's important that we can bring a united regional voice of opposition for this, and ultimately that's where things need to land.
Kia ora, thank you. Elaine, any other part-time? Tuhiao?
Well, kia ora koutou. Koutou ko tai mai ki te hui, te ato nei, koutou kei te no, kei te tipu. I just want to say thank you, Fiona, for speaking to us this morning. And yeah, I understand the weird position that the council's stuck in with having our authority given to central government ultimately. And just to reassure you that we will do, well, I will work to ensure that the council does whatever it can to argue on this application on a scientific basis, on the facts. And I think that's the strongest place we can come from in this position we've got. But yeah, thank you very much for speaking today.
Kia ora. Any other kōrero? Thank you. Ngā mihi, Fiona. Thank you for your time this morning.
Yeah, kia ora. And just to say on final note, yeah, just to be really clear and open and transparent sharing with our community, so we are aware of where the TRC are at. So thank you for giving us speaking.
Kia ora. Ngā mihi noi. Kai. Te whananga I Debbie, kei a koe te wā.
Tuatahi ngā mihi ki a koutou, a kua tai mai. For Debbie Ngārewa Pēkahau. I've come to talk as a mana whenua and every other pōtai that I've been blessed to receive as part of this haringa. Probably one of the things I'm going to do is first of all support everything that's been said. Before us as a region, we have the opportunity to decide whether we actually believe in our own legal system. And as a mokopuna of Mururopatu, it's really interesting to sort of be here, talk about the legal system, the court system, because we haven't done well in it in the past. But one of the things we have done really well with it is actually fighting and proving and having had validated by every court in this land, the High Court, the Court of Appeal, and the Supreme Court, that this company, Trans-Tasman Resources Limited, and the activity they're proposing are neither meeting any environmental threshold and neither does the economic model stack up. So I think to the question that you raised, Ewa, do we want to see those who we've voted and supported and actually will live with beyond 3-year cycles, where many governments won't? Do we want to be able to live side by side with those who represent us and know that they fought with us and stood by us? Or do we want to hear that you were apolitical or silent at a time when, as a region, we're confronting something that could create real reputational damage and obviously environmental and cultural damage? I watched you be silent on Tiriti issues, and I was really interested in your stance on that. But on protection of our moana for all of our mokopuna, no matter what race, and no matter whether they've got thousands of years of whakapapa or arrive here as blessed new kaitiaki in last night's flight. What we have before us is to determine how does a fast-track process and a panel who will not be making the final decision, how does this panel feel comfortable with this regional council on behalf of us all? feel comfortable leaving the decision in the hands of 3 ministers who may not even be here past 2026. This activity is not going to get any infrastructure input into the Moana, even if it is approved, until at least 28, 29. And by that stage, we would have done everything we could have done to stop it, and many of you may be here or not here. So there's at least 2 more cycles of election. And I wonder if this, before you, if really you should be in this position of silence. What I do know is that when we have something that, and we're watching, I don't know how many of our regional councillors have actually read the application that's been put into the EPA site. What I do know is, having had 12, 13 years of being part of this kaupapa with our iwi, with our hapu, with our communities, the fishing and the diving communities, the surfing communities, the farming communities, many who would never vote for my party. What I do know is an exact replica of the application that we contended with in 2019 and 2020 that went to Supreme Court. So I'm struggling to see how you would be silent on something where every other message that we've been receiving is that the courts know better than we do. So I do want to pose that question there. The prospect of whether we would personally, and I've seen thousands of our own citizens here in Taranaki who don't support this activity, would I want you to be silent as my representative? Or would I care that you may not get to choose somebody for the panel? I challenge that whakaaro, because 2 of the iwi, Ngā Rauru and Ngāti Rūnui, have been absolutely opposed to this as Ngā Ruahine. All the iwi and the hapu in Taranaki ki te tonga are opposed to this. Now we're hearing all 8 iwi are opposed to this. All 8 iwi. Now you're going to tell me that the fast track or the EPA process is going to try and divert away and not have anybody, a part of these iwi, to be able to respond to the applicant. Now, assuming that they decide to have a hearing, because we're all guessing. This is the first time process. You're all guessing that there's some fairness through this fast track process and you're going to get to have a say. That hasn't been determined yet. And that's the issue. Is this council going to stand with us? Are you part of us? Or are you going to stand on the side, the little island, away from the rest of us that are fighting this, away from the rest of us that have to confront this, away from the rest of us when our whakapapa is made from the moana, away from the rest of us who go to the moana to relieve ourselves mentally and physically and spiritually? Where do you belong? And I say this as an elected member to other elected members. We make decisions based on what our voters want us to do and what our communities and the people who put us here, and it doesn't always suit the regime or the realm or the house that we're in. But I know when I leave where I am, I go back and I sit right beside my community. Because at the end of the day, you are us and we are you. We may have different ways of seeing life, but the discussion should surely be, what do we do to bring sustainable energy into Taranaki? We are barely coping with the energy equity issues that we have here. What is it that we're doing as a community to make sure that the energy that comes out of this district stays in this district and it creates real jobs, not guessing jobs, not jobs that go offshore, not jobs that we're actually watching the companies still try to raise capital, jobs that actually you would be able to create side by side with iwi, hapu, private investors. That's what we should be looking for economic development in Taranaki. And it's really concerning that we're even having this discussion so long after the battle. So my appeal to you is to support, obviously, our grassroots communities, all of those who have put their heart and soul. And I'm now watching a second generation. I think I was probably Fiona and Rachel's age when I first started this with our whānau. I'm now watching a second generation. They're going to be here, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, with all respect, a lot longer than most of the people in this room. If this comes through, and you can see it in the application, there is no baseline information. The information there is over a decade old. We saw every cycle for mammal activity change post-COVID. There's no post-COVID data in there. There's nothing that validates that the promises of jobs that when I was first here was thousands of jobs is now whittled down to 77. there's nothing to sit there to say that there's any benefit that would reconcile how you could possibly decide whether the environmental damage is worth the economic profits. Nothing. I challenge you to show that. So someone who's slept and lived and breathed this kaupapa for a long, long, long time, I'm really concerned when a company doesn't even have the integrity to put up new information. To sit there and see the exact replica of the application we received in Supreme Court, to me is a takahi. It's a disrespect to all of those in Taranaki who have the intelligence, the integrity, and the cultural vision for our community. So nō reira te awa tangata tātou tūpuna. For in the spirit of those who brought us all here, as a descendant of the resistance, as a descendant of Muru Raupatu, I appeal that you don't be silent on a kaupapa that matters to your people. And I think the last time I was here, I appealed to you guys to stop fracking. And nobody would listen at the time. And it didn't take much longer for us to all realise how damaging that was. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe. Kai wha. Anybody have any questions, comments? Darling?
Quick one from me, thank
Kia
you.
ora.
The fast track legislation is impossible. It's unfair. There are all sorts of issues with it. You mentioned that. The material I've been reading focuses on the environmental issues, and you mentioned the economic stuff. And I haven't seen, and maybe it's my ignorance, a really robust analysis of the claimed economic benefits. Can you point us in the right direction? Talk about that a little bit more, because it's been inflated, but I can't get my head around what the robust analysis is around that.
Yeah, thank you. So we've spent many years doing OIAs, and I think there's probably a ton of written questions in my capacity as the MP at the moment. And what we haven't seen is new data. We've seen data scaled back. We've seen activity that every time there is something to be said, that it's done to the New Zealand Stock Exchange. So what we've been able to do is mirror, I think it may be in the second or third chapter in the application at the moment, there's some high-level figures that are sort of saying, hey, look, we expect to bring this amount of billion in, we expect to do this, we expect to do that, and then we've sort of compared it with what it is that they have on the books, how much capital they're going to need to raise. We've then been able to go out and work out what it's going to cost to obviously, because there's no smelter, there's nothing here on shore, so they're going to have to get ships and things and build infrastructure, which they haven't done. So we've been able to sort of look at some of the old economic data that they gave to us, which we've had on file, and then compare it with some of the other experts that we've been talking to, remembering that this company has got absolutely no operational experience. It's never operated. So everything at the moment is just high speculative stuff that, I'm an investor for our iwi, and we would never touch it with a 10-foot pole. So there is no specific data. We've been working off some of the old stuff that they put in some of the earlier applications and then tried to mirror it with what they're saying. They've scaled back from where they initially promised 3,000 odd jobs to now 77. So, and that's the problem, is that fast track is going to have to weigh up. Is the data significant enough? Is there, there's nothing in that we've been able to see in MB that substantiates anything that they're saying. So, for a few years they had redacted information, and we were able to get some of that, but that's outdated as well. So I challenge for anyone else, as you quite rightly said, to be able to substantiate, how and where are these economic, speculative figures coming from. And based on that, I know in my mind, if I truly believed in my project, I would not only have done all I could do to update my data environmentally, I would make sure I was as transparent as could be to show the district that has to take the hits. This is the first in the world. Once we let one through, the others are going to come. And we have a big impact on the rest of the Pacific. So we've been really conscious of that. But nowhere have we been able to see the data, updated data, anything to say that actually this is worth the risk.
Pātai anō, any other comments, questions? Kia ora. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou, ko tai mai. Thank you for your time, for your efforts in coming today. For those supporters who have come to Tautoko, tēnā koutou. Thank you both for your presentations, and we'll take all of your kōrero into consideration as we move forward through our process. Tēnā koutou. Kia ora. All right, we'll get into our meeting proper. Just acknowledging that on Zoom we have Tuhiao, Councillor Cram and Mitch as also on Zoom. And I'd like to move, if possible, we accept apologies from Councillor McIntyre and Councillor Littlewood. So
Happy
I'll
to
move.
second.
Okay, and Councillor Boyd as well. So I'll move and Susan will second. All in favour, please say aye. Kia ora, thank you.
The resolution just receiving both of those deputations probably appropriate.
Oh, okay.
Just receive them.
Yes.
Yeah.
So just to formalise the receipt of those deputations as well, I'd like to move that we do that
Just
this morning.
receive the two
depu-
deputations.
Two deputations.
From Fiona and
Debbie.
Debbie, yeah.
Can I have a seconder for that, Susan?
Yes.
Kia ora. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Well, thank you. That's passed. Ngā mihi nui. We'll move into our hui for the day, whānau. If we can go to the minutes of our last PMP meeting on April the 29th, 2025, which is on page 4 of our agenda. Recommendations that they're taken as read and we confirm the minutes. Can we have our mover for that? Oh, I'll move, thank you. And Councillor Walker will second. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Any against? That's carried. Thank you very much. And we're now moving into, now my computer has logged itself out. All right, just make sure I'm on par with the agenda. We are into item 5, the Fast Track Approvals Act and Taranaki VTM project, which Finbar will lead out for us. Kei koe, Finbar.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. I'll take the paper as read. I have a presentation which focuses on particularly the technical aspects of the Fast Track Approvals Bill Act and where our process feeds into it, and then very happy to take any questions and discussion. Next slide, please. So where we are now, it's worth noting, well, back to the previous slide, please. It's worth noting, because this comes up later, the purpose of the Fast Track Approvals Act, which is to facilitate the delivery of infrastructure and development projects with significant regional national benefits. That comes up later because that purpose has to be given more weighting than anything under the EEZ Act or the RMA when the panel makes its decision. TTR, sorry, back again, please. So I won't dwell on this. TTR is seeking its approval under the EEZ Act, under the Fast Track Approvals Act. The application has been accepted as complete by the EPA, and the panel convener is now in the process, I assume, of setting up the panel who would determine the application.
When you say the application's accepted as complete, does that mean that there is no further information to be provided?
At this stage, the panel can request further information once it actually starts considering the application, but it just means that the EPA is satisfied that they've ticked the boxes in terms of what the Act says they need to provide at this stage.
So if, as per the submitters this morning, the only information is old,
the panel would look at that and might say, we need additional information around the economics or more up-to-date monitoring data, please provide that. In terms of how quickly that could be provided would be another question, and whether that would affect things.
Do you know, Finbar, whether there's any evidence that they've done any work in recent years, either economic or environmental research?
The main bit of economic work that they've done is there's a paper on the application from March this year around an updated economic impact analysis using kind of input-output modelling, which is a bunch of economic stuff I admit I don't completely understand. But that's the kind of latest, and my understanding is because the Fast Track Approvals Act puts so much emphasis on the economic benefits,
That's where they've done the work.
That's where they focus that additional work. In terms of additional environmental work, we're still working through that as we make our way through the application in terms of what's been updated. But we've already had some initial comments that yes, quite a lot of it is what has previously gone through the process.
But just what would work best for you if we direct questions to you during the presentation, or would you rather get through it?
I think maybe let me get through it because some of it is because it's a bit technical, and then we can have a more discussion of it all at the end if that's all right.
Ka pai, thank you. So, yeah,
Selena.
notes, whānau.
Celine and I have got the message.
Boss.
Right, next slide, please. So in terms of how the panel is established, the panel convener appoints at least 4 people. And we understand that the EPA has only run 2 of these so far under the Fast Track Act. We understand that the panel convener organises a hui, usually with the applicant, relevant local authorities, relevant iwi authorities, and the relevant ministries to have a chat about the skills balance that needs to be on that panel and starting to discuss who should be on that panel. And assuming that we are a relevant local authority under the Act, which is my reading is we will be, we have the ability to nominate 1 panel member who goes onto that panel. If South Taranaki District Council is also a relevant local authority, which is more of a question mark in my mind in terms of some slightly confusing drafting, we would both, either we'd come to an agreement and nominate 1 jointly, or you'd nominate 2 and then the panel convener picks 1 to be on the panel. And it's worth noting the Act specifically says the panel is to be skills-based and it must include people who are experienced with Te Ao Māori and Māori development. And there's no time frame for establishing a panel, so we're not quite sure. At some point we'll get an email probably from the EPA, we hope, and that will give us a better idea of timings from there. Next slide, please. So, panel decision making. Once the panel is established, the ticking clock starts in terms of timelines. So, probably about 10 working days after the panel is established, all relevant local authorities and all relevant iwi authorities and a bunch of other selected people, and maybe anyone else who the panel deems appropriate, will be invited to provide written comment on the application. Once you receive that notification, you have 20 working days to provide that written comment. And worth noting that iwi authorities have the ability to share the application with hapu and include hapu's comments as part of their application as well. Next slide, please. A hearing is optional under the Fast Track Approvals Act. It depends if the panel thinks it would be useful or not. And as has been highlighted, we don't know whether they would or not for this application. You can make up arguments either side. If there is a hearing, we get 5 working days notice that there's going to be a hearing, and you'd be very hurriedly preparing your speaking points. And then finally, a few other bits. This is to your point, Councillor Hughes. At any point through that process, the EPA can request further information. You have 10 working days to provide it. So if you couldn't meet it in that one, the panel just has to punt on with its decision-making process. If granting the application, the panel, and we were a relevant local authority, us and relevant iwi authorities would get a second opportunity to comment on proposed consent conditions. And worth noting that appeals are very restricted to only points of law and those who have been invited to be involved in the process. Next slide, please. In terms of reaching a decision, and one thing to note, in terms of what's changed in this Act, in terms of what is in the bill did originally propose that the ultimate decision-making will be left with ministers. However, that's been changed in the Act, so the panel is the one who makes the final decision. So as I said, the purpose of the Act has to be given more weighting than the long scree of sections in the EEZ Act that you would consider. And this is the one that I really want to stress. The application for an EEZ Act, one like this, it can only be declined if the adverse impacts are sufficiently significant to be out of proportion to the project's regional or national benefits. So that is the key test, really, in the Act in terms of if an application goes ahead or not, once it's been accepted into the process. And it's also worth noting that they've written it into the Act that this explicitly overrides bottom lines and other legislation. So my understanding is part of the reason that the Supreme Court squashed the original application was that because the decision-making panel in the EPA didn't properly consider a environmental bottom line that was written into the EEZ Act. How they've drafted this legislation, those bottom lines probably still matter in terms of assessing the application, but it's no longer translates to an instant no-go. Next slide, please. And it's worth emphasising the bill does provide some guidance on what is considered regional and national benefits. It's kind of squirreled away in a slightly random section, but it's somewhat useful. And these are the ones that I've pulled out that might be particularly relevant for this application. If it is identified as a priority project, either by a region, local government or national, or a sector. If it will deliver significant economic benefits, it's obviously a really huge one for this particular application in terms of the decision making. Whether it will support development of natural resources, including minerals, Whether it will support climate change mitigation. One of the points that the applicant emphasises is that one of the critical minerals in the iron sands, that is admittedly not proposed to be extracted at this point, is relevant for making batteries for cars and stuff. And finally, if it is consistent with local or regional planning documents. So, for example, in Taranaki, is it consistent with Tapawaiwarawa and some of the priorities that are identified in that document? Potentially also, you might pull in some of your local planning documents like our coastal plan into that, but we're still not sure how well that would work. Next slide, please. And then just the final conclusions to emphasise key points. Once again, this thing has been accepted into the fast track process. The bar for declining it is very high, and we shouldn't mince words about that. The timelines for us having input, assuming we're a relevant local authority, are going to be short. But luckily, the application is already up online, so we're able to start undertaking some pre-work on that now. This gets down in the weeds a bit, but the application calls for us to provide written comments, not a submission. So under the RMA, a submission specifically says it may involve, in your submission, you may include whether you support, oppose, or are neutral to the application. This is slightly different, and we're still working through where such a statement, if you were to make it, might fit. I think arguably you could say it kind of influences and might factor into the panel's decision making on the regional and national benefits. However, it's not a particularly strong link in terms of the regulatory framework. And then based on that high level test, there's a whole lot of stuff in all these acts that you could spend a lot of time and money investigating, but really it boils down to, do the adverse effects outweigh the regional and national economic benefits? And then finally, if the application is granted, because the nature of the adverse effects of the plume occur, a lot of them, majority in fact, in the coastal marine area, Regional Council would almost certainly be involved in the monitoring of the consent, and the draft consent conditions that have already gone through and are included in the application does propose that we would have a representative on a group that would help kind of keep an eye on the consent conditions and all the monitoring data, things like that. I'll leave it there. Very happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Craig, then Peter.
Now, I'll start. Thanks, Finbar, for that. And you clarified a few things in there that I wasn't sure about. Would it be fair to say that the biggest, with the three ministers no longer making the final decision, the panel making that is the final decision, firstly, would it be fair to say that probably the most influence we will have will be in our appointment to that panel? And secondly, the biggest influence that we will have, if it all goes through, would be in coming back and setting the resource consent conditions. Would those be fair comments?
Through you, Chair, I think those both are fair comments. I would emphasise when it comes to the person that we would nominate to the panel, that is an independent person who has to approach the application with an open mind and all the things that you would normally assess of a panel. It is not necessarily a political appointment to kind of achieve what a council might have already said in terms of its application. They would be an adjudicator essentially of that. But we would need to make sure that that person, our opportunity is to make sure that that panel has the right skills around that table to give a robust assessment of the application.
Just supplementary on that, would we have, assuming that we are the local authority that is nominated, would we have an understanding of what the makeup of the rest of the panel is prior to nominating that? Like, would we be the last ones, or would we have the opportunity to be the last ones to nominate, so you would be able to see what the skill set looks like and then be able to fill the gaps?
I hope so. It's hard. I can't speak with confidence because this process is still new, but I would hope that in that meeting the panel convener sets up is that everyone in that meeting has a discussion around what those skill sets would be, and then we would go, okay, where does our nominee potentially fit in there? But right. We'll wait and see to a certain degree on that one.
And can you comment on the resource consents and what input, along with, I guess, with iwi, we'll be able to have on that and what relevance they will have?
On the conditions?
The conditions, yes.
Yeah, so we will have an opportunity to, if the panel grants the application, we'll get sent the long list of conditions to provide comment on. The applicant has already provided their own list of proposed conditions that we could provide comment on as part of our initial written comments. However, the main one would be that second range, and then it would just be being as focused as possible in terms of those conditions manage the environmental effects.
Do you imagine we would put out, sorry, last one.
Last one.
Our coastal plan front and centre of that?
So that would more filter and applies to our written comments on the application in terms of the wider decision-making framework. To be frank, the coastal plan is of limited relevance in terms of how all these things are drafted. One, the application itself is in the EEZ Act, so outside of our jurisdiction. However, in the Supreme Court decision on TTR's application, they essentially found that the EPA needs to focus on like the high-level objectives of the coastal plan and the RMA and the New Zealand coastal policy statement, but they don't need to get too sidetracked into the minutiae of the policies and things like that. The exception, though, is if you have a policy that is a bottom line, which says that you must avoid adverse effects on Indigenous biodiversity, which is one of the ones in the CPSs. Those you do really focus on. However, this Act overrides bottom lines. So then you get knocked back down the peg in terms of its relevance. But we're working through that.
Just noting too, for everyone's interest, that Steve Finbar, Sam and myself met with iwi reps last week and have reaffirmed Council's commitment to working with iwi around nominees and open, transparent kōrero around future processes. So I just want to put that on the record as well. We have Peter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question's been asked.
Oh, ka pai.
And I'd like to ask a question after these two.
Okay, so Tuhiao, then back to Bali, and then Mitch, and then Susan.
Go by, lots of comments. Kia ora, Finbar. That was really helpful and answered some of my questions. What I'd like to talk about is just what we could perhaps focus on with our comments from the council, taking into account the corner we're boxed into. I guess like what we, I mean, where we could get them maybe is on the impacts on the fishing industry, I suppose. And what I'd like to just highlight is a few things. So, I mean, in our next agenda item, we're talking about the impacts of sand inundation on the rocky shore, and we've got the evidence now that shows it has a significant impact. So that something could be used, and the same with the estuary experiencing increased sedimentation because of climate change. But also there's bigger kind of impacts on the global scale. Like there's reports have just come out around the insect collapse around the world. Around 80% in some places, all insects are gone, which is massive in terms of the on-flow effects on other animals and plants. There's also the marine thermal conveyor belt, of course, which we know is shutting down. And there's the increased, checking my notes. There's increased sediment and freshwater biota decrease as well, which is going on because of the impacts of climate change. There's a marine phytoplankton collapse happening at the moment, and a change in industry where they're starting to farm the food source that these animals rely on down in the Arctic, which we're seeing Sea Shepherd has been documenting over the last 3 years. And of course, there's the ocean acidification and the other general impacts of climate change on the marine environment. So those are just kind of the physical impacts. But then there's also the greenhouse gas emissions from this industry, which will be massive to be extracting these minerals. And then there's the downstream greenhouse gas emissions from smelting the iron, for processing those other minerals, and particularly if minerals are being used for warfare, as we've been hearing. And the military industrial complex has the highest greenhouse gas emission rate of any industry on the planet.
He pātai e hua? He pātai?
No, it's just comments for the
Okay.
the comments that we have to submit. And so there's also another thing is the polymetallic nodules I've been hearing now they have an important role in the electrolysis, creating oxygen in the environment for other animals and plants. And of course, so my last comment is just that we should mention that the community are very opposed to this industry and these activities, and that it will cause division within the community, which of course will have impacts on everyone. So yeah, that's me. Kia ora.
Kia ora, ngā mihi. Bali.
Thank you. Just a question, if I may, just on the panel again. It strikes me that TRC is going to select somebody on the panel. I'd just like to know what that process is. How does that get done? But in that context, I'm sort of struggling with the environmental issues, and so you might say that panel needs a marine scientist, who can get on from us, as against what we talked about earlier, the potential for taking apart the economic case, which it seems to me, if you look at the fast track legislation, there's an opportunity there to really have a really good look at that economic case, both regionally and nationally. And I haven't seen anything in the TRC documentation that actually does that in the previous submissions. That it's always focused on the environmental stuff. But where is the economic, really good, robust analysis, and to what extent should TRC be putting a bit more focus on that?
Through you, Chair, I'll speak to the panel first and come back to the economic side. Again, we're still learning this process. So I expect that hopefully it runs along the lines of, we have this hui with the panel convener and the other relevant parties. We get kind of a list of the skills that you need, and then you start matching potential members up towards that. Panel members, they have a list of panel members to pick from, but then that's where you might go through that, and then you've got a gap, and then that's where our nominee might come in. They might need to have good knowledge of Taranaki or decision-making processes or coastal ecology, what have you. My kind of working assumption is that our nominee would then come back through council in terms of endorsement from the council in terms of who we're putting forward into the process. Our ability to do that will depend somewhat on what timelines the panel convener gives us. But hopefully there's that opportunity, and then as the chair has already pointed out, we're already in discussions with the Southern Iwi in terms of making sure that we've got a really good candidate that we nominate. In terms of the economics, you're right, it is something that due to the nature of those past applications under those various legislations, those tests weren't so important in terms of the economics. However, we are in the process of, we don't have much in the way of economic expertise in-house, but we are in the process of contracting someone in to provide a really strong assessment of that modelling and the like that they've included in their application. So that's very much part of our thinking.
Just a supplementary on that, if I may. Just in terms of that, I presume somebody independent, somebody with high profile, timelines work?
Yeah, they have been involved in fast track processes in the past and understand how quickly it needs to happen. We're not going to be going out there and running our own modelling. It's a review of the documentation that's been provided.
Just a supplementary question on what Bali's talking about. From some experience of sitting on panels of this sort, often you also want somebody who has the credence with the other panelists to be listened to, just on personality type things. And I've been on panels where somebody like that comes on and they're able to put the arguments well enough in an articulate enough way and have the skills to be able to convince other panel members of what they might not have thought themselves when they kind of entered the arena. So it's going to be very important, and there probably are some people that have worked with the council before who might just fit that criteria, who not only know the business, know the law, know the science, but also have the capacity of presentation. And I think that's going to be unusually important this time, rather than the sort of things that are done outside. It's going to be how convincing the argument is by the person who does it. And that's more than just the knowledge.
I would assume that whoever's nominated for this panel has all of those attributes and skills. I wouldn't think work of this calibre would be relegated to those of us who fumble over ABCs, I would hope. No. Thank you, Mitch, and then Susan. Thank you.
Kia ora, just got two questions. First one's just in relation to adverse effects. One, whether there's any definition around adverse effects, and where does iwi and cultural rights fit within that picture?
Through you, Chair, the Act does define adverse effects. It is along the lines of, it's a slightly interesting definition, to be honest, anything that would influence the panel towards declining the application. So it's quite a broad definition. And cultural impacts would very much be part of that. Going back to the Supreme Court decision, that found that, for example, that tikanga was a relevant system of law that needed to be taken into account in terms of assessing the application. That test still applies to this application, but again, weighted less than the purpose of the Fast Track Approvals Act.
Thank you. And second question, just around decision making for the panel. Does it have to be, is it going to be vote based, or does it have to be a consensus?
Good question. I think it would probably operate on a preference for consensus, but with the ability to have dissenting views, but I don't know that off the top of my head, sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you much. Any other kōrero, Celine? Oh, sorry, Susan, Celine, Peter.
I just wanted to understand, it seems to me that the Regional Council has two functions in this. One, to appoint a suitably qualified person to the panel, and that person would be expected to bring to bear whatever skill set they had to come up with a decision based on the evidence placed before them and their colleagues on the panel. And the second role that it seems to me the Regional Council potentially has is to be a submitter itself. Am I correct in understanding that?
Correct.
And so the two things are discrete. Once the appointment is made, that person's liberated to do the best they can with the information they have. And once the Regional Council is possessed of sufficient information that enables it to make a submission, it can make a submission supporting the application, opposing the application, or choosing to be neutral at that point.
Yeah.
And we are we not, a long way from being in a position to decide quite where on that spectrum we might sit.
Through you, Chair, yes, I would emphasise again that written comment, that distinction between written comments rather than a submission, but you can kind of say whatever you want in your written comments. And that but you want to speak to the relevant tests in the Acts. But yes, we are a while away from when we might need to be making that written comment. Our nominee will be appointed before we make our written comments. For how long it is until we make those written comments, it could be that 20 working days could start in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. We just don't know. And
that appointee, once appointed, is liberated to do whatever he or she thinks is appropriate.
Independent member of the panel.
Is completely independent of the council.
Correct.
Which then makes the council independent and able to make whatever submission it wants. Thank you.
Chair, Ben Finbar, correct me if I'm wrong here, just to elaborate that. I think the other key step the council will have is commenting on conditions.
Oh, yes.
Which it will have to do anyway.
Yes.
That's equally important, particularly given the high bar that for this application to be turned down. And the comments should predominantly be technical in nature rather than, I'll use the words political. Technical in the sense of it's the assessment of the adverse effects, which are obviously different specialties with appropriate experts in that area, and then assessment of the economic analysis, and Finbar's already talked about the fact that we're looking at getting a review of some of the economic analysis. So again, those are quite specialist disciplines.
Yep.
In which we would be looking to put into the proposed comments technical expertise of appropriate specialists in those areas.
So we've got three tiers.
Three
the first is the appointment of the person to the panel.
Yep.
And once appointed, that person is independent.
Yes.
Then the second step that we can be involved in is making a response or submission or whatever you want to call it on the application.
But technical comments becomes the pieces where that's really, if you look at what those tests are the adverse effects of this so significant that it overrides the regional and national benefit? So it's very narrow in its scope. It's not like a normal resource consent application.
I understand it's not like a normal resource consent application, but it must involve some art and not just science.
Yes.
Because otherwise it would be a box ticking exercise. Where I would see the third tier, if the application were to be granted and we were then able to make comment on proposed conditions, that would be all science and no art, probably. Have I got that right?
Correct. And through you, Chair, I just emphasise that I think there is an angle in terms of that more political level to factor into that consideration of the regional and national benefits. Like, does this council think this will be of regional or national benefit?
Which is what I mean about art.
Right. Yeah.
Celine.
Kia ora. Finbar, so the four-person panel, that could potentially be made up of an iwi representative, our representative, and possibly a STDC representative. Is that the way I understand it from what you've said?
Through you, Chair, not quite. So the panel convener, it can be 4 or more if we assume 4. The panel convener will pick 3, we pick 1. If STDC is also involved, they pick 1 from the 2 that we might nominate. But ideally, we'd nominate the same person.
Right.
Iwi authorities do not nominate a panel member, but because that panel needs to have someone who can speak to Te Ao Māori and Māori development, and the development is in Taranaki, I would hope that the panel convener has a very good discussion with them about who a suitable person for that might be.
So it's probably pretty important for us to collaborate really closely with both iwi and STDC on this, in the lead into that panel nomination. And I'm just thinking about the careful consideration we need to give to about who we nominate, and the discussion around the economic impact. I mean, is the economic impact slightly out of our lane, or is it important for us to be able to properly assess the benefits versus the adversity? Because obviously the benefits are all economic. Doesn't appear to be any evidence that there's any other benefits. It's only reputedly economic, whereas the benefits, the adverse effects are predominantly environmental, but have a bit of a broader spread. And so I think consideration on who we nominate for this panel is important. But Steve, probably you can, I don't know, one of you can answer this process. What is the process for that like? Do we have to approve those panel nominees as a council, or are they nominated by the TRC staff?
Through you, Chair, that it's an open question, as I mentioned. I think, from my point of view, you would want that nominee to go up in front of council for endorsement. As I said, the timelines might make that difficult, but hopefully not. And the panel convener will give us appropriate time to put that in front of council for consideration.
Look, if we need to, we can call an emergency meeting in 24 hours. So and obviously, hopefully it doesn't come to that. We'll have a bit of time to work that through. And this is all hopefully the sorts of discussions we can clarify with the panel convener once they make contact with us.
And logically, we'd want to plug any gap.
Yeah.
So we wouldn't want to have them appointing 3 economists and us appointing 4.
And again, that's the sort of stuff you'd expect. No doubt the panel convener will want to balance as well.
Yeah. Just a comment to that, it would make sense that there's that consensus would come from Taranaki, from iwi, from councils, so that there would be even less reason to reject anybody that we might nominate. We put the best foot forward on all our behalves. But Celine, last comment.
The other thing that be interested in your opinion on, Finbar, is the submissions we've had from the public today around a collective opposition of seabed mining. And as I questioned Fiona on, I have concerns about the perceived conflict around that. What's your opinion on that? I mean, if this council was to join other councils in opposing seabed mining, do you think that would have a negative effect on the process and the written comments and the panel member or not?
Through you, Chair. I think it would be, my recommendation to the council would be that discussion is had when you are considering the written comments that the officers propose.
Premature.
Because that will be after we've appointed someone to the panel, and it is the appropriate time to have that discussion around our view on the regional and national benefits.
So to go back to my 1, 2, 3, it's appropriate after 1 has been confirmed.
Yeah, as part of 2.
And when we're dealing with number 2.
We have to see the actual documents. Otherwise, we're then accused of already making up our minds before we've seen anything.
Yeah, good point. Thank you, Peter, and then Liam.
Thank you. Given that the economic benefit is the underlying driver of this whole process, is that defined anywhere? For instance, if Taranaki were to make 5 bob and the government was to get 5 bob in tax, is that economic benefit?
It doesn't have a line of saying if you earn 25 bob, it's considered significant. It is a judgment of the panel in terms of whether the development would create enough jobs and enough growth to outweigh the adverse effects.
So it's like beauty, it's going to be in the eyes of the beholder.
Based on a couple of thousand pages of various reports.
So how, if the company says, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to make, this is how much tax we're going to... So everyone, apart from the specialist modelling that's going to occur, the panel will just accept that. There's no counter to it, other than perhaps the specialist modelling that the council might do. But in the end, the panel could just ignore it anyway.
If you draw there will also be a bunch of staff at the EPA who will be providing very detailed advice to their panel. So like if this was a resource consent application and someone would provide us a bunch of economic information, we would go away and assess that as part of our process. So we'll provide input on the economics from our written comments. My expectation, as it kind of has already been touched on in the deputations, that'll form a strong part of the written comments provided by iwi, and then the EPA staff itself will be providing their independent advice to the panel on how they stack up.
Because I've already seen figures quoted in the paper by the company, and it looks great, you know, benefits on jobs, tax, but no counter assessment. So I'm assuming that that's what the specialist will be doing, is actually looking at what they're claiming and assessing whether that's
and again,
realistic.
I think, Finbar, it's no different to a normal contested resource consent application where the applicant has their experts, the appellants have their experts, and council, in the case of a resource consent application, has its officers working with the hearings panel to provide advice. So it's really that contesting of experts complying with the appropriate codes of practice, putting forward their arguments.
Lead him.
5 bob, did you say? Oh.
Thank you, Melina. I find it awkward sometimes when we have these kinds of conversations as an appointed member of this panel appointed to the Parliament and I did just want to make a note of that. I wish
I can't hear.
Is the mic on?
Sorry.
Alright, I will start again. I often find it awkward in these types of conversations as an appointed member, appointed in farming on farming matters, and particularly Federated Farmers' opinion on the surveyed opinion, and there's no way that I can. And I'm listening to the recording in this room, completely confident that I don't need to be part of this conversation in order for the views of the farming community, something outside of farming, to be represented. So I just wish to be excluded from any voting or that's not to try and be neutral or try and move away from it, just that I just don't feel that that is.
Good point. Thank you, Liam. Thank you for explaining that and clarifying and stating your withdrawal from the process and the discussion. That will be noted. Do we need to formalise that in any way, or just accept to?
I took her comments through. She's just abstaining from any vote or discussion on the item. So we'll just record that in the minutes as Liam abstained.
Thank you. Any other comments? I just have some comments, maybe part-time before we finish up. Okay. Just in terms of the economic benefit, I'm finding that really interesting too. And some of the comments that I've been hearing out in the community is that while there may be figures touted about economic benefit, there may also be pushback from the community with businesses who decide to cash in if the application is granted. So while will that also be factored in potential loss of business activity for those companies who engage with the application, the project, if it goes ahead? Because we don't often hear of that kind of thing being taken into consideration. Yes, you may earn this much, but the local community is going to withdraw their support, so you're going to lose this much. So just wondering if that might be factored in somewhere, someone's magic equation. The other things I'm interested in is can we refer to other examples of projects that have come in with promises of work and economic benefit, and then are we able to utilise the analysis of whether or not those promises were kept or those economic benefits were realised as a part of whatever decision making we may come across? Because there are examples of that already in Taranaki, where at the front end everything looks great, as Peter has said. At the back end it hasn't been so great. So will those examples be relevant to our discussions? And the other question I have is around the conditions that TRC may be able to comment on should the application be granted. Do we front foot those as a part of our comments going into the application? Like when we're making comments, do we have to wait for approval before we would say, well, actually, if this application is granted, these are the kind of conditions we might look at imposing, rather than waiting for approval and then negotiating those conditions? Is that something feasible and reasonable?
I'll start with the first one. In terms of the impact on businesses, I don't know how much that could be taken into account. It's probably a bit of a long bow in terms of what's in there.
So unquantifiable in real terms, but it could be something that businesses may need to be thinking about.
And that might form if in terms of talking. You could speak to it at a qualitative level, but it would be very difficult to verify with anything quantitative or kind of that it would happen and to what degree it might happen. Sorry. Other projects, good point. We can look into that. And my ears very much picked up in the deputations in terms of some of the previous work that's been done at looking at the potential for them to realise what they've said, and if anything could be shared there, would be very interested.
I think it's also a legal question, Finbar, for the lawyers to answer in the first instance. There'll be some established law around acceptability of expert evidence and not.
Yes, but in fact, this is quite a common thing, because you can rest assured that the applicant puts the best case, gets the best advice, pays all sorts of experts to say all sorts of stuff and emphasises it, and the panel will, I hope, be of a quality that is going to challenge all these things and ask how real they really are. I don't think we should necessarily think that the panel is just going to stamp it and say, that's great. I think it's going to be, but to be effective and the whole thing to be effective, it is a fast track to get the thing done. It's not a fast track to make sure it is done.
Okay.
And just to note, as I think about it, some of these discussions around I guess the financial fitness of the applicant would have probably been addressed as part of their permit applications under the Coastal Marine Act in terms of that side of the regime. So we can look into that too in terms of how those were assessed. But by the grant that they have mineral permits, the MB was satisfied that they are fit and proper and yada, yada, yada. And then your final point, yes, if we can provide comment on the conditions as part of our written comments, that's great. It's just a matter of whether we have time considering the pressures involved and if our resources are better spent digging into the technical detail of the adverse effects, we'll focus on that knowing that we have a second opportunity to comment on those.
Presumably, Finbar, we have no autonomy over those conditions either. We can only make recommendations and they will be set by the panel.
Correct.
Can I ask one more
sorry,
question?
Neil, Donna, I missed your hand, Donna. Sorry about that.
It's all right. I just wondered, I'm just a bit surprised, well, shocked actually, that we don't have an automatic right to have someone on the panel. And is LGNZ working hard to maybe, because we won't be the only region affected by the fast track process, will we? You know, are LGNZ trying to do anything to work with government on this?
Through you, Chair, the panel convener cannot reject our nominee. Who we nominate, assuming we're the only relevant local authority or we are in agreement with South Taranaki.
But you're not saying that we don't know that that's a definite, do we? That
No,
we're
it is
even
definite.
gonna get
Our nominee will be on the panel.
So we will have someone on the panel.
We will have a nominee on the panel in terms of who this council says is appropriate. They will be on the panel, noting if STDC is also involved and they nominate someone different, then the panel convener has to choose between those two nominees on who that person is.
I think her question is that we may be a relevant local authority, not that we definitely will be.
I would say I'm 99% confident that that's a very dangerous thing to say in a public forum, but I'm very confident that we will be a relevant local authority. And we are listed as such in the applicant's own application.
Must they have one, I guess is the question.
In terms of a nominee from us?
Must they have a relevant local authority?
The Act says if for things in the EEZ, you're a relevant local authority if the activity is occurring in adjacent to your region, the activity is right on the border of the territorial sea. So very likely.
Okay.
But I'm just a bureaucrat who likes to deal in certainties.
So just about all of these fast track, therefore by definition, applications will have a relevant local authority. Thank you.
Okay, Donna?
Yeah, thank you. It didn't come across clear earlier on.
Okay, and thank you for bearing with us, Donna. I think you're about 12 hours time difference, right? So it's the middle of the night.
Yeah, a little bit tired now.
Yeah, thank you for
that's
hanging
okay.
in there.
No worries.
Okay, team, we've got a very meaty agenda.
One last
question, sorry, Neil.
If I may. And this is that the person who's the panelist, we really do want the very best person that we could get. And knowing, again, that those persons are often involved in a whole lot of things and have a lot of skills or a lot of commitments to various things, it would probably be important that we get Steve and you and whoever it is to start thinking about who the panelists would be as soon as possible so that we can kind of book them for this if it comes that way. I mean, I wouldn't want to be in a situation where we were given a very short time or a relatively short time to find the panelists and we were kind of, we had a listing of people who we thought would do it. And we went through that list and found, well, hey, they've committed themselves to a hearing somewhere else or they've done some other thing. So I'd like to think that we would
work's starting. Quickly. Yep, that work is starting. As mentioned, we're in conversation with iwi. The commitment's here to get those conversations happening as soon as possible. Kia ora. Ka pai. Any other comments regarding this very chunky, meaty part of our agenda? We release Finbar from this application. And again, thanks to all those who came. You're welcome to stay for the rest of our hui, or you're welcome to go on with your day, but thank you for coming and gracing our chambers with your presence today. Tēnā koutou.
Be happy to move the recommendations.
Ka pai, thank you. Craig's happy to move the recommendations as per page 11. Can I have a seconder for those recommendations? Thank you, Susan. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Any against? That's carried. Thank you, team.
Kia ora, Chair. Just before we move into the next item, I just need to give my apologies for the rest of the agenda.
Kia ora. Thanks, Mitch.
Okay, tēnā koutou.
Tēnā koutou. Tēnā hoki koe. Okay. We're now on to State of the Environment, Rocky Shore report. Thank you, team.
All right, so I'll just ask Dr. Jesus Valdez to come up and join me at the table, and we'll move through these next two items relatively quickly. I know you've got a lot on the agenda coming up. So this report speaks to our most recent summary of 30 years of Rocky Shore monitoring, which Jesus leads as our coastal marine scientist. It discusses the richness and diversity of species and also provides a snapshot summary, which we've worked with our science communications team around summarising and presenting for the public, which also builds on our estuary monitoring as well. So we're happy to take the report and the accompanying information is read and move to questions.
Kia ora. Thank you, Abby. Anybody got any pātai? Peter?
I'm particularly interested in Mangatee Reef, and I was having difficulty getting to grips with it. I thought I saw that there was some sand inundation, sand problems, but it seemed to indicate that that wasn't having an impact on the biodiversity there. Have I read that right, or have I got it wrong?
Through you, Chair. Great question. So sand fluctuations are indeed a natural process, and what we can see from our 30 years of data that is included in that report is that we do have events in which there's sand, but they're not long-lasting enough. So there is an effect on species richness and diversity, but it's followed by a recovery of the species once the sand follows its natural course.
So it's a natural occurring phenomenon. So all we got to worry about is the sewage that's poured out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other kōrero questions? Oh, Tuhia.
Yes. Thanks, Bonita. Again, just thank you for the report. It was really interesting and good to see Manahi's doing well. I just had a question around the sediment. We know that the port was dumping dredged sediment to the south. I'm not sure exactly when, but I'm just wondering if there's any way to track if some of that sediment was from there. And the other question is just, given the previous discussion around the potential seabed mining, can we add more monitoring sites into the south of Taranaki? So if we do have to deal with this activity, then we have the baseline, well, some kind of baseline evidence to see how it affects it.
Through you, Chair. Excellent question. I think I'm going to let Thomas McElroy speak on that. Thank you.
Come and sit by Celine.
Yeah, through your Chair, so in response to that first question, we do have a consent monitoring program.
You might need the microphone.
Is it on green?
It's on green.
Kapai.
Through your Chair, so yeah, in responding to that first question, we do have a consent monitoring program in place for the Port Taranaki maintenance dredging regime. I can't speak specifically to any knowledge of deposition or dredging campaigns where they deposited sediment outside of the two designated zones, which are kind of adjacent to Kawerau Reef. But yeah, as part of that monitoring program, there are intertidal ecological surveys that Jesus leads. There are visual sand monitoring inspections pieces, and data is provided from the port to keep an eye on those effects. But to date, there hasn't been any evidence linking sand inundation to that activity.
And the question around further monitoring opportunities to create data?
I can probably answer that one. So always happy to consider additional monitoring with the indulgence of council's budgets. So yeah, no, it's something we can certainly have a look at and make some recommendations on if that's of interest.
Okay. Would that, sorry, Peter, just would you have any suggestions, maybe you can talk to Tuhiao directly around some of the areas you may think may be relevant for further monitoring. Would that be all right, Tuhiao?
Yeah, I'm just definitely in the south. Like there really wasn't much. Sorry, I haven't got the map in front of me anymore. But
Kapai.
Yeah.
Kia ora. Thank you, team. Any other comments or questions for staff, Peter?
I note that Kawaroa isn't part of the monitoring regime, and I recall many years ago when the port company applied for dredging and dumping of sand, we were quite concerned of the effect it might have on Kawaroa Reef. But I see there's no monitoring there, and it's a very important reef from our perspective. It's where we got a lot of our kai because it's easy to get to. So is there any thought of perhaps monitoring there?
Through you, Chair. So to answer that question, we do have sites that are associated to a different program. So the report presented today talks to the state of the environment, Rocky Shore, and it includes those 6 sites that you would have seen. But we do monitor sites in Kawaroa and Arakaita Reef as part of the Port Taranaki dredging program. So they do get monitored, and we apply different methodologies there to keep a close eye on how there could or could not be an influence. And our data there shows that there hasn't been significant effects from the dredging of the port on those particular reefs. Thank you for bringing that up.
Celine?
Is the reason that there are so many sites in North Taranaki and effectively only 1 or 2 in South Taranaki just the incidences of reefs, given this is a Rocky Shore report, relevant to the kōrero about additional monitoring sites? Should seabed mining go ahead, presumably they wouldn't be included in this because there's not the incidences of reefs to monitor in South Taranaki. Is that correct?
Through you, Chair. So yeah, it's a really good point you raise. I think within the report itself, there's another map that kind of highlights the distinction between the Laharic sort of volcanic coastline and how that transitions into a more sedimentary coastline as you move further north and south throughout the region. So looking at that figure, you can see the existing 6 sites really do focus on that volcanic part of the coastline. But as Jesus pointed out, there are actually a number of other sites sort of interspersed between the SOE locations that are kind of more focused on for consent monitoring purposes, but that could be something to pursue in the future in terms of bringing that all together and trying to provide a more complete picture of all of the monitoring we do.
Okay, thank you, team. Thank you, staff, for that information and those responses. Can we have a mover for the recommendations, please, on page 88? Moved by Councillor Walker, seconded by Councillor Williamson. All in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any against? That's carried. Thank you very much. Now moving on to macroinvertebrate metrics. I wouldn't have been able to say that a few years ago.
While Friends making her way up to the table, this was in response to our recent State of Environment report brought to you recently. There were some questions raised around some of the trends we were seeing, the recent trends, particularly over the last 10 years, which had switched from predominantly over 30 years being improving to seeing some degradation. So we put that question to NIWA scientists and asked them to provide us an analysis of all the environmental monitoring data that we have to try and determine what was driving those more recent changes. So while we always have to acknowledge the limitations of our monitoring data, we do have a very comprehensive macroinvertebrate program. The challenge is really is where those sites are aligned with water quality and flow monitoring and where they're not. So they've done a really good job of modelling that and trying to provide a bit of some insights really into what the causes of those things might be. And yeah, it's a combination of things, but what it really speaks to, I guess, is the impacts of climate, but also on things like nutrient levels and so on and so forth. So in terms of targeted the report really re-emphasises a lot of the work that we're already doing, and we'll be discussing in a bit more detail later in this meeting around interventions like riparian shading, managing water abstraction and out water allocation, and also nutrients as well. So I'll take the report as read, as with the other, and we have Fern Kumarawa here to answer any questions that you might have of more technical nature that are beyond my expertise.
Welcome to the table, Fern. Anybody have any questions for the team?
Just
Neil.
Read the report again, quite detailed and fully. One of the biggest factors does seem to be what might be described as climate change kind of things, which are resulting in more extremes up and down, times when the streams are very low and times when they're in flood. So is that the overall picture now, that this sort of pattern is the biggest predominating factor?
It's certainly confounding a lot of what we're seeing in science, and particularly with shorter term trends, like anything less than sort of 10 to 15 years. It's really hard to untangle, I guess, the climate impacts from other impacts. So that's why our 30 years of data is really important when we're talking about trends. So we want to be mindful of things that are happening over more recent time periods, because they can highlight where perhaps we've got emerging issues. But yeah, climate definitely is a confounding factor that is hard to untangle, I guess, from those other things. And we see this coming through in this report. What they have managed to tell us is that while that might be overlying some of the other things we see, nutrients and other things, periphyton growth and so on, that might be impacted by other things beyond climate change, are also important for us to manage. So particularly as the climate's changing and as time goes on, we're likely to feel those impacts more frequently and to, with more impact, higher impact. So we need to be managing those things carefully.
It might be a bit of a long bow, and that's not in this report, but does that have any implications about the amounts of water we can take out of streams, whether any of those rights might have to be addressed?
So water allocation is definitely a topic that we are looking at closely through the development of the Land and Freshwater Plan, and how we allocate water and how we ensure that those allocations are efficient and encouraging things like storage and harvesting during times of high flow are all matters that we're exploring at the moment.
Which is, we'll talk about that further on.
We'll talk about that a little
today.
bit later on.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions? Oh, Tuhia, out of my.
Yeah, all good. Kia ora. Just a couple of questions. There's a pretty graph on page 115 of our agenda pack, which is a rolling graph of trend categories. It's the kind of green, grey, red one. I'm just curious why it's dropped a bit in the last couple of years, and whether the most recent data that's not in here would show that it's gone up again, given we had the drought. And so the second question is, again, just wondering why there was pretty much none of the samples east and south of Hawara were analysed, because it would have been really good to see how they've changed.
Through you, Chair. The rolling graph was part of the original state of the environment, which was presented maybe a year ago, and that's what influenced us to reach out to NIWA. We had hoped that this modelling analysis would give us a bit of indication. They unfortunately only did look at it in the sense of decades rather than, so it was all clumped together in the sense of why something was increasing and decreasing. So that could be a further question that we could look at from this, now that we have this report. To relate to your sites, unfortunately, like probably most programs, we're very lucky that the macroinvertebrate program is 30 years old. It is older than I am, which makes it very robust. Unfortunately, it did start being targeted around the ring plane, and we are slowly working at increasing that, which accounts for why there are so little sites. In the terms of trends and monitoring, it does relate to how much data that we have, and a lot of the sites that are down south or even up north are low in data sets, which means that if we continue monitoring, then we can start doing these as well. But we are expanding out into that way, and we would take recommendations if you did have any sites in any area of the region where you might want to see improved monitoring. The unfortunate part of the macroinvertebrate program is that we don't have a lot of our sites aligned to other like water quality, periphyte and sediment parameters, so we are limited in those sort of parts of the analysis. So we would also take recommendations on things other than macroinvertebrates, which could help us drive those questions.
Okay, so this could be a good opportunity again for further collaborative work with iwi reps and our potaio in this space. Is there potential, budget willing, for more of that work to be done around coordinating and coalescing all of those data sets so that we get the bigger picture instead of these siloed results?
Absolutely, and that one is one that Council's already committed to through our long-term and annual plans. So the other part of FIRN's role is working with our iwi potaio around the design of the monitoring network. So welcome those conversations always, and happy to advance those in terms of how we shape that network up and get it in a bit more robust way. We've got some really good recommendations here from NIWA around some of the things we need to think about in terms of that, but I know the conversations that FIRN's progressing are really valuable as well. So.
Kia ora, thank you. Donna?
I'd just like to say about when you're talking about collaboration, don't forget the catchment groups in that as well.
Okay, thank you, Donna. And back to you, Tuhia. Final comments?
Yeah, just a supplementary comment statement. I'm not sure. I noticed that there's 4 coastal southern sampling sites. Perhaps we could recommend to add those to their analysis process.
Thank you. If that's all the questions and comments for ourselves. And thank you for reminding us just about the age spread in the room. Slightly painful, but very relevant. Just gives us a reminder of where we need to be focusing this age group. Kia ora. Ngā mihi. Thank you for your time. Good. So team, we're only partway through our agenda. What we're suggesting is that we adjourn at 12:30 for lunch, and then we eat very quickly, and we come back again at 1 p.m. So we'll power through as much as we can before then. If that's okay. So Donna, you'll be able to go and replenish with a midnight snack somewhere along the way.
I think we're past midnight now.
Our next item. Oh, yes, sorry. Can I have a mover, please, for recommendations on page 328? Thank you, Neil. Seconder, thank you, Craig. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Any against? That's carried. Okay, next item, investigating drivers of temporal patterns. Oh, no, we've done that. Freshwater implementation update, and I understand that's Lisa. Thank you, Lisa.
Kia ora all. Hope you're all doing well. I'll try and keep this brief, given where we're at with the agenda. So this is our 6-weekly update, policy update on freshwater matters. Probably just a couple of things I want to draw your attention to in this paper is I have just given a really brief overview of the government directions that were announced a bit over a week ago. So the government has now released a suite of national direction documents for consultation, freshwater being one of those. The consultation process is running until the 27th of July. So as staff, will delve into those documents a little bit more detail and bring something back to you at your next meeting to consider putting in a submission to government on. I've just outlined in paragraph 8 the various topics that this discussion document relating to freshwater focuses on. The government has indicated that they're going to be doing 2 phases of freshwater consultation. So what is in the national direction paper that's in your agenda packs for freshwater is actually quite high level still at this point in time. We understand that they'll be seeking feedback on this in terms of setting the direction for themselves and consulting on that. And then there'll be another stage of consultation later in the year where we hopefully will see a bit of a draft MPS maybe pop out the process at that point in time. The other important thing just to note too, that as part of the consultation, the government is also asking the question about whether they continue with freshwater now or whether they put a pause on that and and to deal with it as they are with most of the other national direction through the RM reform package that is obviously coming in the coming years. So quick glance at it, I think it's probably fair to say a lot of the direction that the government's kind of heading in, we feel as staff at a high level is aligned with where we've been taking our freshwater policy direction to date. A couple of clear examples the team will take you through a little bit later on, but for water storage, for example, the government's identifying a need to better provide for water storage, but they're still leaving that gap as to how you do that in terms of how you allow for the take of high flows to be sitting with the regional council. So that's still a gap we'll need to fill. So that policy discussion we're going to have with you later today on a later item will cover that. So just wanted to give you the heads up that that document has landed. Happy to take any questions on it in a moment if you do have any. We've also outlined in the updates just we're continuing to draft the plan, and we're continuing to bring through to you topics for discussion as we did last meeting and this meeting, and just to give you a little bit of a plan going forward over the remaining council meetings for this year. We've included a table in there just to set out the topics that we're intending to bring to you at different times. And I've also just put in, I guess, a few notes, just a reminder, I guess, of the workshop process that we're hoping to undertake with you for the remainder of today's meeting on the items. I guess just a little bit of a, and Nicole's got a specific agenda item next up around what standing orders we're actually suspending to enable that. But the purpose of the workshops is really to seek some feedback. It's an opportunity for all members to kind of, I guess, inquire with staff what's sitting behind the direction that we think we need to be taking at this point in time, identify areas that you think would be useful for us to have a look into to help your understanding of the direction. And just a reminder, I guess, that the formal decisions on policy direction or policy adoption doesn't really occur until later in the piece, which is that notification point. So the policy refinement process continues between now and then. There's many opportunities for feedback from yourselves or for community as well as we continue to do that refinement. And an example of that is the animal effluent paper that we're bringing back to you today is part 2, because we had a good discussion about it last week. So just, or last month, sorry. So just encourage to use the opportunity, I guess, to really question staff on the direction that we're setting in front of you, acknowledging that we do need to kind of keep the process moving. So I'm keen to seek your support and direction where you feel you can give it. And then just the final update we just want to give you is just a verbal update, is just on a coastal plan matter. You may recall back in February, we tabled a paper to undertake a targeted plan change to our coastal plan for policy 43, really to aim to fix some ambiguity about the locations of the marine reserve areas that policy is protecting. We're at the point now of having a draft issues and options paper, so we're about to jump into clause 3 consultation with iwi, with government departments and those other interested parties that did submit on that policy through the coast plan process. So just wanted to flag that to you, that process is continuing underway. Following that, there'll be a clause 4 consultation, which is consultation just for iwi again, before we bring a paper back to you later in the year around requesting notification of a plan change to fix that issue we've got with policy 43 in the coast plan. So just wanted to flag you to give you an update on that process as well. So yeah, happy to take any questions on this paper.
Good, Elisa, thank you. Tuhiao.
All right, again, I'm just curious. I'm getting a little bit confused on some of the terminology used for tangata whenua. So we've got the iwi po from for freshwater maria for ngā iwi. Then we've also got the iwi po from each iwi, and then we've got the Y steering group. I'm just curious, like further down in other documents, it keeps referring to ngā iwi or Taranaki. When we're saying that, are we saying people from each of the separate iwi, or are we saying the entity ngā iwi or Taranaki? And also, I guess specifically, who are the Y steering group now? Are they still active?
Yes, yeah, happy to take the question. So through you, Chair, when we refer to, I guess, the ngā iwi or Taranaki freshwater potaia, that we're referring to Maria in her position there. When we're referring to iwi potaia, that is when we're bringing together the potaia from each of the iwi and having a collective discussion around policy direction. And then the Y steering group is a group that is still active. It has Steve Ruru from Council, and then 4 iwi elected members being the Water Ohu, I think, which has got Mitchell, Anadu, Dion and Graham. So we bring those crew together every few weeks to give them an update. They're a good sounding board, I guess, for us to present these kind of policy direction papers, to present what we're hearing from each of the individual iwi potaia and staff. And we kind of use it as an opportunity, I guess, to flag where we think there might be some areas where we might be diverging on outcomes, where iwi might be wanting us to go a certain way and we might be unable to facilitate that through the policy drafting. So that's how we're using the Y steering group, whereas conversations with Maria occur all the time. We're constantly working with Maria on that, and then we're bringing together the iwi potaia every few weeks on topic-based discussions at this point in time. Did that help?
Yeah, no, that's good. And sorry, last question is this. We're talking about monthly workshops for this committee. Are these extra on top of our normal meetings, and also three other iwi reps going to be called in from the regulations committee?
Yeah, through you, Chair. So those, the table that's set out in paragraph 13, those meetings are the policy and planning committee meetings that are set out for the rest of the year. The only difference to that is the September one, because we don't have one in September. So what we're proposing to do there is actually use the council meeting, but invite the policy and planning reps to that meeting. As far as I'm aware, the operation and regs iwi reps aren't invited to those processes at this point in time.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments, questions for Lisa? Right, thank you, Lisa. Can we please? Any recommendation? Yeah. Phew. Okay. Can we just note that report and note its receipt on page 415? Thank you. Can I have a mover? Thank you again, Neil and Craig. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Any against? That's carried. Kia ora. Cool. 20 minutes to go until lunch. So we keep plugging through?
Keep going.
Okay.
Nothing like lunch to encourage them to be brief.
Get there.
Awesome. So are we suspending standing orders now? Or? Okay.
Yeah, so look, we, as you know, a couple of meetings ago, you signed off on suspending standing orders for consideration of the land and freshwater plan items. Last month, we got ourselves a little bit tied up on what was applying and not applying. So we've been through here and identified the particular standing orders that we think are relevant to suspend when we're discussing these items. And they're listed there, and we've also included a copy of standing orders, so you can refer to those if you wish. Really, that's the guts of it, just to give some more clarity on what you are suspending. Happy to take any questions.
Any questions? So I'd like to move the recommendations that we suspend standing orders as per the report. Can I have a seconder? Thank you, Celine. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Any against? That's carried. Thank you. Okay, moving on to the first workshop. We're back to Lisa.
Me
Good,
again.
Lisa.
Kia ora. Thank you. So I don't think we've got a presentation. Oh, we do. Lovely. I'm going to take you through the integrated management component of the draft land and freshwater plan. So what we're really, I guess, seeking from you all today is any commentary or areas where you think we might be missing policy coverage for integrated chapter in the plan, but also if you've got any thoughts on whether or not this section is actually needed for the plan drafting. So just as a bit of a reminder, I guess integrated management is really about setting policy direction to manage natural and physical resources in a holistic way. How that kind of manifests, I guess, when we're talking about freshwater is really focused around the effects of use and development on of land on water. So that's why I guess it's quite an important distinction that this iteration of our plan drafting is actually the draft land and freshwater plan as opposed to just a freshwater plan. So we're trying to have a look at within council's responsibilities of managing land, how the activities on land can actually impact water. It also covers off on thinking about and managing freshwater as catchments as a whole, and then talks to obviously the effects on receiving environments and what comes to mind, I guess, there is also the effects on estuaries and coastal areas as to how we're managing our freshwater. An important note that we've set out in the paper is that it's not a mandatory component of the national planning standards. But it is, staff feel like it is an important component for us to consider including in our draft plan. But in doing so, we need to have a bit of the issues of including an integrated management chapter in the plan, as we need to think about how it might intersect with the land and freshwater chapter, which I'll take you through in a moment in terms of its role. It's an opportunity to manage any conflicts that might occur throughout the plan. And we need to be always mindful that anything that we're setting at that integrated management level or that strategic level, that we must be cognizant of it being able to be achieved and supported through topic-based direction. Next slide, please. So probably the easiest way, I guess, to describe and maybe for you to visualise how the integrated management chapter works in a plan. This is, I guess, our draft table of context for the plan as it stands at the moment. And this is set out to us by the National Planning Standards, components of which are mandatory and some which Council may choose to include. So part one is pretty straightforward. It's just your introduction, your general provisions around how your plan functions. It does include the Tangata Whenua chapter. We have queried with MFE, and I have in a previous role, around whether that's the right place for Tangata Whenua chapter. Unfortunately, MFE's advice is that is where they would like to see it stay. But that really sets out, I guess, the role, the history, and the importance of Tangata Whenua in managing resources in Taranaki. Then part two starts to step in where you really see your policy direction and objectives, policies, and then eventually rules kind of come into play. So we have our integrated management chapter that sits at the front. So anything that's contained in the integrated management chapter applies to the whole plan. Then you'll start to step into what they're calling domains through the planning standards. We've got a land and freshwater domain. That is where policy direction needs to sit if an issue or a policy direction covers more than one topic of freshwater management. So there's a potential for, we've got to be mindful, I guess, of a potential of conflict or confusion between what an integrated management chapter does and what a land and freshwater chapter does. And then you step into your topic-based directions, and that's kind of where there's, if you've got directions specifically just on how bed structures in the beds of lakes and rivers are managed, it sits in that LF bed chapter, and that's where you'll have objectives, policies, and your rule framework will sit to guide consenting processes through there. But if there's a relevant provision that's sitting, a relevant policy direction that's sitting in your LF chapter or your IM chapter, then they come into play at those topic-based levels as well. So that just to give you a little bit of an idea of where the IM chapter sits in the plan drafting. Next slide, please.
Lisa, which one's given priority?
We shouldn't. The way we're drafting at the moment is that we're not necessarily we're wanting to try and draft so we don't have prioritisation. There's some strong case law around setting blanket prioritisation within plans. So I guess what I'd say is that the IM chapter does apply to all decisions, whereas the LF chapter will only apply to where there's relevant topics. And way we're drafting at the moment is hopefully to avoid any conflicts between that, if that makes sense. If there is conflict, because it is like, we're dealing with quite complex matters here. So it's not to say that we might not end up with some conflict. That is where you can deal with, the IM chapter can deal with that. It can say in these instances, this is how you work through those conflicts if you're a consenting officer or an applicant working through the process. So that direction, if it's needed, will sit in the IM chapter.
Thank you.
So as I've said, we feel as staff, even though it's not a mandatory component through the planning standards, we feel like it's a pretty important part of how we set up the land and freshwater plan to function. Reasons why is that it aligns with the integrated nature of natural resources. It's the opportunity to really support catchment management process and objectives in freshwater. And it can also be a place where you can really start to drive and support long-term objectives for your plan as well. Keeping in mind that we want to minimise those instances where we might create conflict, we are proposing to keep it a very tightly focused chapter so that it will focus on strategic direction for the plan. As I said before, it will set direction if there's any conflicts or prioritisation that needs to be identified, and it will set the expectations for collaboration. Next slide, please. So in the the paper itself, and I'll quickly run through these and happy to take questions. We've started to draft what we think the IM chapter should be covering. So the draft objectives that we've gotten there from paragraph 21 onwards from in the paper, we've got an objective around ki tai, which is an objective that will really focus on the interactions within the environmental domains. So as I said before, freshwater, land and the coastal environment, and it will seek an outcome that we're starting to think about those things holistically in the decisions that we're making. There's proposed to be an objective around life supporting capacity and MODI, which is really talking to the importance and value of freshwater in its own right. And it will draw on the concept, I guess, that life supporting capacity of water is essential for life and is critical for ecosystems and cultural values. This is one objective that, depending on where the government lands with provisions like Te Mana o Te Wai or their overarching objective framework, we're going to have to come back to this and make sure that we're aligning with those provisions. But I guess the way we're viewing it at the moment is it's really setting an expectation around what is good freshwater management. The next objective is around the reciprocity of freshwater. So that acknowledges that, freshwater is providing for our well-being, it's providing for our health of our people, but the plan is going to set up, I guess, that framework and parameters for within and how that can occur. So essentially the health of well-being and people is provided by the healthy nature of our and our life-supporting capacities of our waterways, water bodies. There's an objective around partnership for tangata whenua. This will be where we're directing, I guess, high-level direction for partnership with tangata whenua, keeping in mind that some of the topics may require specific ways in which we need to account for and provide for cultural values and how we work with tangata whenua through specific topics, but this is setting the scene for what Council wants to achieve. And we're conscious that we also need to bear in mind what the outcomes might be around the Waitara River Committee processes, and also the Taranaki Maunga Collective Redress Act will need to be reflected in these objectives too. As I said before, there's potentially a need if we have to put in a provision that directs how we deal with some competing values. And then this is where we'd view to set some overarching expectations around how climate change is considered in decision making. Also noting that, as Abby alluded to in the previous conversation, that a lot of our setting of environmental limits and things like that through the plan are already being embedded in thinking about climate change impacts, but this will set the policy direction for decision making. That's where our objectives is kind of being directed for at the moment. Sitting below that will be policy direction that we'll need to start to think about, the environmental interactions of decision making, any cross-boundary management of resources that we might have, how we actually go about putting those objectives around working with tangata whenua into practice, transitions in resource use over time, and obviously, as we said before, some integrated management and interactions with the coastal environment. Next slide, please. So keen to, I guess, kind of hear any thoughts or questions that the committee might have around the role of that IM chapter and its inclusion in the draft plan. As I said, staff, we feel like it's an important part of the plan. In that same context, do you have any thoughts on us keeping that tight and narrow focus as we've got it at the moment? And then I guess further to that, is there anything missing or anything you want us to further consider in what we've put in front of you today?
Thank you, Lisa. I just had a query on, when we're talking about ki tai, we talk about freshwater land and the coastal environment. Does air quality come into any consideration around water?
It can do if there is a link. It's a trickier one to link those two, management of resources, but that's a good one. We can have a look at that. There will be some activities that do trigger, I guess, air quality concerns. And we can have a look as to whether, yeah.
But just so really, from me, the inclusion of the chapter provides clarity where there's overlaps and certainty where there's gaps. To sum it up.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions?
Just one very brief one. This system allows us much more flexibility in the sense to be one size fits Taranaki as distinct from other systems we've operated in the past. And do we have to actually consider any national links, say, with other councils or other things like that? Does that have any effect, or are we given the freedom to be much more local in this situation?
Through you, Chair, we obviously do need to have regard and give effect to any national direction that's being set. So that is that kind of chicken and egg process we're finding ourselves in at the moment with the national direction being reviewed. With regard to, I guess, adjoining councils, we do look at, as we're drafting up provisions, we do look at what other councils have done, particularly councils that may have been through hearings processes or environment court processes more recently, because if there's any kind of case study direction that's being set, it's useful for us to have a look at. But essentially our plan is council's plan, so we can set the direction that we wish. If we do find that any of the direction that we're setting, if we're concerned about any kind of cross management boundary issues with our adjoining regions, then this would be the chapter where we can identify any of those issues or concerns.
Right, Donna?
I was just thinking I'd like to see it out and what the effects are on those other policies before I gave an opinion as to whether I was for it or against it. And I like the idea of it being tied if ever, but it's hard to, for me, it's quite hard until you see the whole picture to truly understand the effects.
Mm-hmm.
Any other comments, questions?
I just think we have to go a bit further down the road before we can really comment properly.
Needham? Okay. Any reflections, any comments? So in terms of then the request for more discussion and more work on that, does that make our
I think that comes later on when you see these are really high level principles in effect at the front end, which set the framework for the rest of your policies. What I'm hearing is you want to see the complete package before you commit to anything.
Or maybe how it affects.
So actually, let's come back when we see, which we will, as we've said, come back once we get the whole lot together. See what it looks like as a package.
And
so
just
our
perhaps,
recommendations are, sorry, Lisa, you go.
I was just going to say, just maybe perhaps to add to Steve's point there, we can, in those topics that we're bringing through to you in the coming meetings, we can kind of add a bit of a report into, a bit of a section into our reports that kind of says this is how it's responding to some of that integrated management direction, if that's useful. So you can kind of start to see how that IM direction is influencing some of the policy decisions we're making in topic-based areas.
Okay. So from what I'm seeing, what I'm seeing and understanding is that nothing that we are asking for isn't out of kilter with the recommendations as they've been set forth in the agenda.
No, just to note too that we're really quite close to an election. So what's going to happen there is there are at least 3 positions to change here because of people who are stepping down or whatever. And as well as that, there's also likely to be the other representatives are appointed too. So it's, I guess not much will happen until after the election because there'll be a different team making decisions on these things.
Well, we'll see how quickly we can bring it back for discussion. Okay. So if we're all happy with that, can we have a mover for the recommendations on page 568? Thank you, Councillor Walker, seconder. Thank you, Tuhiao. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That's carried. Thank you, team. And with 2 minutes to spare, we might take that as an early lunch. How's that? Giving you 2 minutes. So thank you, team. Can I just check, though, that we've had numbers dropping off? Is everyone here for, all of our committee members here for the rest of the hui? Which,
absolutely.
Fabulous.
There'd be nowhere else I'd rather be.
Thanks. Just looking at making sure we maintain our quorum. That's all for this afternoon.
What is the quorum for?
7.
3, I'll be gone.
Yeah. So we're okay at the moment.
If you're after 3 o'clock, I'll be gone.
Okay.
Benita, can we bring it back a bit? Because there's some quite important things coming up. And it's going to be another half hour, isn't it?
20-minute lunch? 20-minute lunch. We're back at, well, you get 22 minutes at 12:50.
Madam Chair, could we possibly actually just get what we
Hello, where are you? Hi, David. Welcome to the farm. Welcome to the team. I'm sitting behind your 7 cows that you bought. Do they look all right?
Donna, you should probably mute yourself.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Emily.
munching and slurping are still acceptable. As I rush you through lunch. Kapai. So we're good to go. Thank you, Donna, for hanging in there with us. Okay, we're on to Fish Passage with, is it Bridget and Tyler? Can I present to us today?
Yep, Bridget is one of our policy analysts and Tyler, one of our
If you
freshwater
both like to
scientists.
just come and sit next to Celine, she'll be kind, I promise. Thank you, team. All yours. We're in your hands.
Tēnā koutou, ko Bridget Hatu-Tokuinga. I'm a senior policy analyst with the policy team, specific focus on including.
Can you please speak into the mic?
Yeah.
Struggling to hear.
I've got a focus on in-stream structures and disturbances.
Yeah. Tēnā koutou, everyone. I'm Tyler. I work in the freshwater and coastal team as a freshwater scientist. Mainly do a lot of the fish work and in-stream structures.
You've got the presentation. Thank you.
So starting off with just a little bit of background. As we know, Taranaki hosts 20 native fish, 3 sports fish and 4 pest fish. Of these, 15 are diadromous, meaning 15 of these fish species undertake a migration within their lifetime, either from the sea to the rivers or the rivers to the sea. And fish passage pretty much refers to the ability of fish to move freely between habitats without disruption. So they just need river connectivity without the kind of blockage from barriers, so they can get to their critical spawning areas and feeding areas. And it's just overall essential for completing their life cycles. If you go next slide, please. Oh yeah, next slide, please. So in-stream structures are a pretty big issue at the moment. Right now, there's a projected 29,000 or so in-stream structures within the region. That number is also including model structures, but through the riparian program, we've identified around 15,000. So these structures, they all have characteristics such as vertical drops or fast-flowing waters through a culvert as such, that makes it hard for a fish to navigate the barrier. So think about it, a small fish the size of your finger trying to swim through a 20-meter long culvert with extremely fast-flowing water. It's kind of like trying to run into 50-kilometer headwinds and you don't get very far. So yeah, as I said, there's a high number of structures, and many of these are historical structures and are unlikely to provide fish passage. Some of them are authorised, which meet all permitted standards across the existing rules, and some of them are also unauthorised, which meaning they're either illegally installed or they were installed legally at the time, but now they no longer meet the permitted activity standards.
And we also have a few legislative drivers in this space. So the NPSFM provides direction for the council to maintain or improve the passage of desirable fish species by managing in-stream structures. And I just thought I'd add a wee side note here that from what I understand, the proposed amendments to the freshwater package that Lisa mentioned earlier, they don't change this direction. So yeah, we still have to maintain fish passage. So to implement the NPSFM direction, the council is required to update the regional freshwater plan, identify desirable and undesirable fish species, and develop a fish passage action plan, which I'll talk on brief, like in due time. All of these factors combined have encouraged us to investigate an updated approach for the management and remediation of fish passage. So I'll just briefly talk on community expectations. So last year during freshwater consultation, the council sought to understand the community's readiness to complete structure remediation works. and to also understand how we can best support them in these efforts. So nearly 40% of participants indicated they would need at least 10 plus years to complete remediation works, whereas around 30% indicated they could do it within 1 to 3 years. So there's a range of readiness in the community. Generally speaking, the community supported remediation targets that took the location, condition and cost and circumstances of each structure into account. And the community highlighted the need for easier consenting pathways to reduce regulatory burdens in this space. In preparing our recommendations, we've also undertaken an iwi management plan assessment and have also reviewed position statements given to us from Pōtao from Ngā iwi o Taranaki. The iwi management plans highlighted the expectation that fish passage for native migratory species must be unobstructed and that pest fish species are undesirable. It also highlighted that our rules should provide for mahinga kai gathering structures, and the position statements expressed a clear expectation that the council work closely with Ngā iwi o Taranaki and collaborate particularly on matters related to fish passage. So next slide.
So our current work to date, the council currently has regional and site-specific compliance-based programs. So for the regional program, it's kind of a all structures program that encompasses local government, roading agencies, and private structures. So looking, as of May 2025, there's around 650 or so structures within the region. And for the regional, so the regional compliance program is, as I just said, and site-specific compliance-based programs is more industrial areas where there's a structure for things such as a water take, mainly the bigger structures. And we also have the State of the Environment program. So we have 21 fish monitoring sites, and these are used to track trends in distribution, general fish health, fish numbers, and the impacts of land uses and in-stream structures. So there's a spread around the region, and we're currently using this data, for example, target setting, using the fish index of biotic integrity. Next slide, please. This is a project that we carried out in February of this year. This was the Timaru weir removal. It was a pretty big project, and it was in the works for a while before I started my time here at TRC. And it encompassed 4 full days of in-stream works alongside 4 full days of defishing the immediate area below the weir. The weir itself was around 15 metres wide, and we used an upstream and downstream fish exclusion to prevent the re-entry of fish that we caught immediately below the weir. There was about 4,000 fish that we had caught, including redfin bully, eels, inanga, which are one of our migratory fish that are endangered or threatened. And so all of the concrete material was reused. It was used either on farm races or for a new driveway, I believe. And this removal of this weir unlocks around 24, 25 kilometres of upstream habitat for the fish. Fish recruitment happens yearly while juvenile migrations occur seasonally. So at the moment, there's no data to show the kind of movement of fish at the moment, but give it a couple of years and it should be a really good example, especially coming out of the region. So next slide, please. And just here are a couple of photos. So we have up top the before, which is of the weir. I don't know if you can really see it. It seems a bit small on here. And then in the middle is directly after the works were complete. You can see it's kind of, a river once again, and down the bottom is after the first major, fresh or relative flood that we had at the start of April. So we can see that the river started to kind of naturally regrade itself into its former glory.
So this project provided some practical insight into applying the national environmental standards and the regional plan rules for the purpose of remediating an in-stream structure. And so the national environmental standards in the current plan require that new in-stream structures provide for fish passage. Together, they both provide a useful base from which to work from. And in this perspective, we're not starting from scratch in the fish passage space from a regulatory point of view. However, we view the draft plan as an opportunity to further promote fish passage remediation. Our goal with the new draft plan, is to provide consistency and ease of application when remediating in-stream structures. In the memo, we've outlined a number of ways in which we propose the new plan to enable and encourage fish passage remediation, including a permitted activity for the removal, maintenance and alteration and minor extension of a structure, and the promotion of bridges and large culverts over other structures that restrict fish passage. We also are proposing some updated permitted activity conditions to be better in line with current best practice guidelines. Next slide. So these pieces of work here are supplementary to our broader management framework, which I just outlined. So I'll just touch on them quickly. So, like the current plan, the draft plan will require that all new in-stream structures provide for fish passage. However, this time, we are required by the National Policy Statement to differentiate between desirable versus undesirable species. So we're proposing that a new in-stream structure will provide for fish passage unless it is being actively managed to prevent and barricade the upstream movement of undesirable fish species. Just a note here, the circumstances in which a structure would be allowed to be a barrier to undesirable species are likely to be quite rare due to the tight design and management requirements that are necessary to ensure the efficacy of that project. So in the first instance, we are proposing that all species native to Taranaki should be classified as desirable fish species, and that trout should be desirable in areas where they currently reside. We propose that pest fish species should be considered as undesirable in all locations. Also, as briefly touched on earlier, the NPSFM requires the Council to develop a fish passage action plan to outline a program of work to enhance and restore fish passage and set targets for structure remediation. It's just important to note that our draft plan needs to align with the goals of the Fish Passage Action Plan to support the remediation of historic structures while avoiding unintended incentives to just abandon the structure. So, next slide. So, the main next step within this space is going to be engagement with iwi and Fish and Game. We are currently in the process of organising a hui with both parties. Further internal engagement is required to test the draft rules, particularly the specific activity conditions. And we are also looking to past remediation efforts like the Timuruwea to learn valuable lessons that will support the development of a functional draft freshwater plan. Any questions?
Hilda, thank you, team. A lot of work going on there. My first question is, for those who say that the I'll start again. Those who are saying they might take 10 years or so to achieve the outcomes, what kind of barriers are they facing why it's going to take 10 years?
It would be different per person, but from when I was out there during community consultation, it was usually maybe the structure is it was quite a significant workload.
Right.
Those are big structures, whereas there's some smaller efforts, I guess, that can remediate.
So finances sometimes?
Yeah, I think just through finances and the scale of the structure itself. Right. They will take different amounts of effort. Some culverts can be remediated in a few days, some others can take up to weeks. Consenting processes and things.
Thank you. Alan?
I just had I see you're only monitoring 21 fish sites throughout the area, and if you remove all these barriers in the rivers, how do you know that these pest species are not going to migrate and be a lot bigger problem than what they are now by removing some of those barriers to the fish? Is there a control on that side of it?
Through you, Chair. So I think we have a database of pest fish species or known areas of where they are. I think when it comes to remediating and removing barriers, we need to know where these pest fish species are. Do you have any word from Bart's report? No.
So for some of the cases through you, would you then not want the barriers removed until you've just about eradicated the pest species or tried to?
Yeah, so some barriers would want to remain in place. If there's known pest fish species that are, if a barrier is blocking a pest fish, then you probably wouldn't want to remove that barrier for them to move upstream and invade other areas. Yeah, so some barriers are used or even made to prevent the spread of pest fish.
If I can perhaps jump in here too, I think, like as Bridget alluded to in the presentation, those instances will be quite deliberate. The advice we've been getting so far from our ecologists is it's a tricky balance of providing barriers to pest species, because often then you were providing barriers to your native species or your desirable species for them to be able to complete their life cycle as well. So it'd be quite deliberate places, I suppose, that we'd need to be thinking about maintaining barriers for certain pest species and making sure we're not having that unintended consequence then on the native or the desirable species to be able to progress their life cycle process. And that's where the Fish Passage Action Plan can potentially come into play in a bit of a non-regulatory sense in terms of helping us prioritise where you're going to get bigger bang for your buck, I suppose, around removing fish passage for various purposes, where we know as well, I guess, in that process that TCC, for example, the catchment communities are doing a lot of work in fish passage areas, and so the role, I guess, that the action plan may play is to help give them some direction around how they might work through those processes as catchments as well. But the role of the plan, the regulatory side, is to really try and make sure that the plan's not the barrier for people to be doing that remediation work when they want to, because we have heard, and there's been instances, and Tyler, you probably know with some of the remediation processes you've been involved in, where the plan's been quite tricky to navigate when the outcome is actually what is an environmental benefit that we're wanting to facilitate. So that's the focus, I guess, of Bridget's work at the moment, is to make sure that the plan's not the barrier. The action plan then can be a non-regulatory tool that we can help communities work through that prioritisation as they jump into these processes themselves.
Thank you, Lisa. Neil? I was just going to ask three questions, I guess. The first one is about what fish you're actually talking about. For example, obviously I know that in some rivers or some places, even Lake Rangipo, there's rudd, which of course is called to be a most undesirable fish. I'm not quite sure the details, but there are things like that there. But then there are also introduced fish which people probably want, like trout. Now you can think that trout are going to eat native fish. So where does the line go? Another one might be mackerel, which again come up some rivers and are prevented by barriers getting to go further, and the sort of mixture between introduced and sporting fish, you might say, and these things is, so that's one thing. I'm just correcting my hearing maybe. Did you say there was actually 29,000 problems or areas that needed adjustment?
Yeah, through you, Chair. Yeah, good question. So the 29,000 comes from, that is including modelled structures, but there are definitely, at least we know from the riparian management program, that officers have gone out and documented at least 15,000 structures.
So if you fixed one a day, it would take you 20 years. Okay.
Something like that. Yeah.
And the other one is, I noticed that you're saying no consents, but will that be a consent condition? And ultimately, will that sort of mean that
that there'll have to be an element in consents about, say, culverts and all those things that they have to change because of this?
Yeah, so consent conditions generally encompass a fish passage consent condition where the structure must provide for fish passage. Yeah. And going back to your first question with trout, so it's a bit of a grey area. There's a lot of research and science and debate around it, where trout are definitely classed as a pest fish, but they also provide substantial fishery value. And yeah, so I think where we should go with that is trout are desired and where they already are, but undesired in areas that they haven't reached yet.
Through you, Chair, just on that point. So Section 7 of the RMA requires us to have particular regard to the protection of habitat of trout and salmon, so it's a statutory obligation. But I think the team's trying to kind of thread the needle of where they are as their habitat, where there isn't their habitat, so we've got a bit more leeway to play there.
Donna?
I was just going to say I like the direction, the option 2, but I think there's probably some, and it has happened in our catchment, an opportunity for local hapu and catchment groups to work together, and it should always be that way anyway. Once I think relationships develop or evolve, that that we can work together in how we improve fish passage from the sea up to the mountain or Moana to the Monga. But yeah, so I think there's a real opportunity here.
Thank you, Donna. Any other queries or Liam?
Thank you, through you, Chair. Am I right that at the moment there's a like a blanket approach to how culverts need to be replaced, and they have to be like of a large size that's very expensive, and a nuanced approach that allows for actually site specific remediation?
I can answer that if you like. So we've always had the approach where anyone that needs a consent, or in fact within the current framework, it needs to provide for fish passage. Under the NES, it's quite restrictive in terms of what's permitted, and that would potentially be expensive because you need to be sort of 1.3 times the stream bed width, etc., to be permitted. However, you can get a consent that doesn't necessarily meet those permitted rules, but you will still have to provide for fish passage. So it'll be on a case-by-case basis. We also look at the size of the culvert in relation to flooding, etc. So generally, to meet the standards that we require, it's going to be big enough to allow for fish passage provided it's installed correctly. A big part of it isn't just the size, it's how it is installed in relation to the bed of the stream or the river as well.
It's not a simple process.
In terms of the actual physical work, you mean?
Yeah, or getting to knowing that you're doing is the right kind of work.
So that's why we have a consenting process. So the permitted rule is quite restrictive, it's quite prescriptive, and you probably need to be somewhat of an expert to be able to comply with it. And of course, when you get a consent, that process of getting a consent will go through engineers within council and ecologists within council as well. So that process is relatively robust in terms of the expertise that look at that particular activity and then determine whether it's going to be appropriate or not. And then, of course, we will follow it up with compliance monitoring to ensure that the conditions that we've set to meet those requirements are complied with during that installation of physical work.
Perhaps one final thing to add as well is that the culvert rules in the NES are part of what's been consulted on at the moment in terms of changes to national direction. So that's something that we'll look at as well in terms of how opportunities for improvement in those permitted activity rules.
Yeah, thank you. I just merely ask, it's part of the barrier to be able to get things done in a costly way, in a
cost-effective way.
In a cost-effective way, in a way that doesn't take too long, and that's part of the reason why. got a lot of structures and there's a lot of complicated stuff around it. So yeah, the easier and more simple we can make it for farmers to be able to do what they need to do on their land.
Thank you, Leadham. Any other comments or discussion points? Donna, with your leaning towards liking the direction, would you be willing to move the recommendations? That we do that? Thank you. Donna, can I have a seconder? Yeah. Thank you, Leadham. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Any against? That's carried. Thank you, team. Thank you for your hard work. The fish, thank you. Kapai, moving on. Contaminated land and waste.
Yeah, I can introduce Hannah Goslin, one of our consultants working with us on the land and water plan. Hannah's been the lead author in working through this, so she's going to take you through
Hannah,
the
could you
detail
sit
of this
in the
presentation.
seat by Abby? It's just really hard for us to see.
Yes,
or
yeah,
hear.
sure thing. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for having me. So I'm Hannah Goslin. I'm the current author of the Contaminated Land and Waste chapter for the draft Land and Freshwater Plan. I'm joined today by Callum McKenzie, who's a scientist in the land and freshwater team and a contaminated land specialist. So if you've got any questions that are specific to some of that technical detail, we've got Callum on hand to assist. So the intent of today is to just provide a bit of a high-level overview of the preferred policy framework for contaminated land and waste in the draft freshwater and land plan. And as I said before, more than happy to take questions on the way through or at the end of the presentation. So land is considered contaminated when it contains hazardous substances that could impact human health and the environment, and that could be due to a range of historic or current site uses, such as those that are listed up on the slide there. In the past, the management of activities that typically result in contaminated land were not as well managed, I guess, as they are today in light of sort of more current best practice guidance and things. And so as a result of that, contamination from those legacy uses can persist for many years. That contamination, so it might be petroleum hydrocarbons or heavy metals and things, can be retained in the land and then be transported to water and negatively affect water quality and the ecosystems or other values that, that we use water for. Next slide, please. So when it comes to managing contaminated land under the RMA, there are a range of responsibilities that the regional council have responsibilities for. So regional councils are responsible for controlling the discharges of contaminants to land and to water, and to investigate land for the purpose of identifying and monitoring contaminated land. And this differs somewhat to the responsibilities that territorial authorities have, which are to prevent or mitigate the adverse effects from development, subdivision, or use of land, and to administer the national environmental standards for contaminated sites. So that's a nationally consistent document that includes a number of regulations around changing land use. So previously contaminated sites being changed to residential subdivision or that sort of thing. So the driver of that particular document is to protect human health. It doesn't stray into protecting like environmental things such as like freshwater management and that sort of stuff. So yeah, next slide, please. So as part of our policy work for the draft land and freshwater plan, we've undertaken an analysis of the current policy approach to these activities in the regional freshwater plan currently. And we've identified two key issues that we think require a policy response. So the first one there is that some activities are not currently managed via specific rules in the current plan. So there are things such as clean fills, controlled fills, in cemeteries and things. Discharges from these activities are currently subject to a catch-all rule, which might be overly onerous for some smaller scale things, and might not be protective enough or directive enough for others. The second issue that we've identified is that industry-agreed best practice guidance for a range of activities has sort of moved on since the current plan was put in place. And so there's a real opportunity to, I guess, include some of the key requirements from these best practice guidance materials. So we've got up there the Wasteman's guidance. So that's for specific to disposal to land. So clean filling, landfilling, that sort of thing. And then we've also got some Ministry for the Environment guidance there around site investigation and analysis of contaminated soils. Next slide, please. So in response to these issues, we're proposing to introduce a specific contaminated land and waste chapter that manages landfills, closed landfills, managed, controlled and clean fills, cemeteries, passive discharges and site investigations. Next slide, please. And
Can I just ask one question about that, just listen,
sure.
if I may, just quickly. What about things like closed industrial sites? We've got fertiliser sites that have been closed in Taranaki. You've got old hospitals and things of that sort, and you've also got old dairy factories, often which had waste dumps and things attached to them. I live next, or own a piece of land next to one, and all sorts of things keep falling out of the old dairy area. So would those sorts of sites be included in there too?
Yeah, through you, Chair. So that sort of, if you want to jump back a slide, those sorts of more legacy contaminated land issues would fit under the passive discharge provisions that we're sort of looking at.
Bowling clubs, former bowling clubs.
If there's a passive discharge, yeah, that's right. So the intent of these tables is to just provide a really summarised high-level view of how we're proposing to manage these types of activities. So we've got, sort of on the left-hand side there, the types of activities. Then for some activities, we're proposing that there would be a permitted activity pathway available. So that means that we'll have a range of conditions. If those conditions can be met, then the activity can be undertaken as a permitted activity, so no resource consent required. Where those conditions can't be met, then a resource consent would be required. And we've done a bit of high-level thinking sort of around an appropriate activity status for each of those things as well. So for clean fills, managed fills and controlled fills, we're still doing some investigation around how to split up these things. We might look at having some separate rules for them. But we're looking at including some permitted activity conditions that would cover things like setbacks to surface water bodies or drinking water supplies, requirements that any filling isn't to groundwater, and conditions that require compliance with the best practice documentation that I mentioned earlier, the Wasteman's guidance sort of being the go-to one for those types of activities at the moment. Where those permitted activity conditions can't be complied with, resource consent would be required as a restricted discretionary activity. For landfills, we think that the risk of those types of activities is such that there shouldn't be any permitted activity rules. So this is different from sort of farm dumps and things that's covered in the paper. We're dealing with those as part of the primary production chapter of the plan, so we'll come back to you to talk to you about those. But just sort of general municipal waste, municipal landfills, that sort of filling of land, we think would require to be subject to a resource consent process. And then for closed landfills, there's already a rule in the current plan that manages closed landfills, so we're proposing to roll that over and update it to require sort of adherence to best practice guidance, which sets out requirements for monitoring and reporting of discharges and that sort of thing. There's also the introduction of another permitted activity condition to cover natural hazard risk, sort of with climate change impacts and that sort of thing. A lot of closed landfills are sort of in precarious places that could be at risk of sort of flooding and inundation and that sort of stuff. Where those types of conditions can't be met, then we're proposing that resource consent is required as a restricted discretionary activity. Next slide, please.
Oh, sorry, Donna had her hand up.
Oh, sorry.
On here. Donna, did you want to ask your
I-
question?
Yeah, it was just to, can you define clean fill, managed fill, and controlled fill?
Yeah, sure. Through you, Chair. So clean fill, so each of these types of fill, they're defined in the Wasteman's technical guidance. So we're proposing to use how that best practice guidance defines these types of filling activities. Callum, you might want to jump in if I start to stray. Clean filling, so the definition of clean fill is literally, under this new guidance, is virgin excavated material. So it's literally soil and rock that is uncontaminated. It's free from any sort of contamination. Next is managed fills.
Controlled fills, I think.
Controlled fills, which is similar sort of virgin material, excavated material or soils and that sort of thing, but with some demolition and construction waste.
So the managed and controlled includes inert materials, which are currently considered clean fill, or under the old regime, so sort of clean fill materials, but the new guidance very much has clean fills as strictly natural material. Controlled and managed includes the inerts, so your concretes and various different things, excluding organics generally. The difference between controlled and managed being the extent of contaminants above background levels that are permissible in those. But the question is, do we want to confuse the situation by having managed and controlled fills, or do we have one level between clean fill and landfill, which is kind of a necessity to prevent everything from going to landfill?
Good point. Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you for that.
Great. So final slide there. So these are the three other activities that we're proposing to introduce a specific rule to cover. So site investigations, we're proposing a permitted activity rule which requires compliance with the best practice MFE guidance, and also requires a site investigation report be provided to council, so council can update their contaminated land database with the information. For passive discharges, so this is sort of the legacy sort of contaminated land situations that are sort of around in a lot of places. We're proposing that there is a permitted activity rule, but there needs to be an investigation that's provided to council to sort of delineate the extent of contamination, that the discharge can meet discharge limits, and that's something that we're working on and would apply to a whole range of different activities in the draft land and freshwater plan, and that the passive discharge is not within a source water risk area, so to sort of mitigate some impacts on drinking water supplies and that sort of thing. Where those conditions can't be met, resource consent would be required. And finally, cemeteries, we're proposing to introduce a rule to authorise discharges from extensions to existing cemeteries or new cemeteries. We're currently looking at or doing some investigation around a maximum area limit, so small scale things would be able to be part of a permitted activity sort of rule, but alongside that having some other conditions around setbacks to surface water, that sort of thing. Source water risk areas where there's a high level of natural hazard risk, or areas where the groundwater table is high such that it could rise up. Where those conditions can't be met, then resource consent would likely be required.
So there's a few questions about that one, which are existing cemeteries, some of which, and also there are private cemeteries in a sense in various places in Taranaki. And of course, Benita will be talking about your part as well, won't you? Because there'll be quite a number of those associated with various marae and all that. Well, they won't require a consent or anything, will they?
No, so that's what we're trying to sort of investigate in a bit more detail with looking at a maximum area limit. Existing type cemeteries, we're not looking to require resource consent through this particular rule. It would just be where there are extensions to existing cemeteries, or new cemeteries that are over a particular threshold. So we're currently doing some work to try and work out what that threshold is.
Because that could be quite a problem.
Interesting. You're going to have some interesting conversations.
Yes, yeah.
Come on. Any other comments or questions? No? Thank you, team. We have recommendations.
I move.
Thank you, Celine. Another seconder. Thank you, Neil. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Any against?
Aye.
That's carried. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, high flow harvesting. Lisa.
Felicity Boyd, who you all met last time, will be presenting this paper. So I'm sure Felicity's on her way up. I can't quite see. It's hard to see from there. She is. So yeah, I'll hand over to Felicity. She's going to take you through a presentation on high flow harvesting framework that we're starting to delve into.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you for having me again. Here to talk about high flow harvesting today. Yeah, that's fine.
There need to be one glitch.
We should introduce Fiona too from our science team. I can see the back of Fiona's head there. So, so yeah, Fiona's been working with Felicity on our allocation framework. So is our water quantity scientist.
Yes, so Fiona has done all of the technical work that underpins this, and then I have just translated that, I guess, into what does it look like in a plan, and what does it mean for what people can, when people can take water. Yeah, I'll just start for now. Just to get us all on the same page, because there is quite a lot of different terminology around the country about what this activity is called. We're calling it high flow harvesting in this context, and what we're talking about is taking water from rivers when their flows are high, and usually because flows are higher less of the time, it means that you can only take water, you can take water less often than a normal run-of-river take. Usually these types of high flow harvesting takes are used to fill a reservoir and store water so that it can be used when rivers are running low and there might be restrictions on the ability to exercise a take directly from the river. So high flow harvesting can be really valuable for water users because it gives them much greater reliability. If they're able to store water, then they're not so affected by cease take points when flows are low. It means that they have an additional source of water to use in times when flows are low and they can't rely on the river. And it can also really help decrease the in-stream effects of abstraction, because when flows are higher, rivers have a bit more resilience to the effects of taking water, and it means that there can be less pressure on those rivers when they're at low flows if people can rely on their stored water. So this is just a graph to show you, I guess, what a flow and allocation regime looks like. You've got down the bottom the water that has to stay in the river at all times, and the minimum flow is the top of that. So when you get to the minimum flow, people have to stop taking water and leave that bottom part of the water in the river for the fish and everything else that lives in there. Then you've got your primary allocation block, which is what most people in Taranaki are relying on. That's the normal run-of-river take that you can take pretty much all year, except when that minimum flow is reached and you have to stop. Most reliable type of water take, because you can take most of the time. Then we have a block above the primary allocation where, again, there is water that needs to be left in the river, and that's really to provide flow variability. It's really important for river health to have flushing flows and freshers that go through the river to carry sediment and periphyton down the river system, can help with fish passage and that kind of thing. So basically there's an upper limit on the amount of water that can be taken. Some water stays in there to allow for that variation. And then high flow harvesting or supplementary allocation is that bit right at the top, which when the rivers get high enough, people can take. Once the rivers drop again, then they have to stop taking. So when we're talking about primary allocation, we're usually talking about MELF, mean annual low flow, which is a measure of essentially how low flows get and how much water needs to be left in the river at those times. When we're looking at high flow harvesting, MELF is not quite the right metric because we're talking about those higher flows rather than the lower flows. So Fiona looked at what other regional councils do around the country, and most councils do have a regime for high flow harvesting. I think there were only Taranaki, Gisborne, Nelson and West Coast regional councils that didn't have a specific allocation mechanism in their plans. Some councils rely on mean flow, which is the average flow over a period of time. Other councils rely on median flow, which is the middle number in a set of flow values. And the median flow happens more often than the mean flow. And Fiona put this helpful hydrograph together that just shows, it's a little bit hard to see, but the bottom red line is the median. So that one happens more often. Mean flow is higher, and so it happens less often. And these were the two sort of ways that we considered setting in a high flow harvesting. You know, what metric do you use to set the minimum when people can start taking? And the conclusion that Fiona reached was that the median flow is going to be more appropriate because it still gives you the ability to manage that flow variability for in-stream health, but it's also a bit more reliable for users because it happens more often than the mean flow. So in terms of the take and allocation limits, the amount of water that you're able to take affects obviously the flow variation and the flushing flows. If you take all of the peaks in a river, then the flow just flatlines and you don't get those healthy freshers washing things down the rivers. And a measure for flow variability, a common one used around the country is free-3. So that's the annual number of flood peaks that are greater than 3 times the median flow. And Fiona's report looked at the impacts in small, moderate and large rivers of different allocation limits. So if you can take at median flow, how much can you take before you have to stop again? And basically looked at the impact on free-3 and found that option 1 is a pretty small level of change to the free-3 statistic, not really a noticeable change at all, but obviously the more water you can take, the more impact there is and the less flushing flows you get in those river systems. So then, as a result of that work, the recommended framework that we're talking about is to have one supplementary allocation block. In other parts of the country with bigger rivers and higher flows, it can be common to have multiple supplementary blocks with a break in between. We didn't think that was appropriate in Taranaki given the small size of the rivers. They just wouldn't reach those really high flows often enough to make it worthwhile for water users. In terms of a minimum flow, so the point at which people can start to take or have to stop taking again, we think that median flow is the appropriate metric for the reasons that I've talked about. And looking at the impacts of those different allocation limits, i.e. the amount of water that can be taken, we considered that 10% would be most appropriate given that it didn't really affect the flow variability very much, so long as a few conditions are met. The frequency of the flushing flows doesn't decrease by more than 5%, which is consistent with that table before about the impacts. The frequency and duration of low flows doesn't increase, and the takes don't prevent primary allocation users from being able to take their consented volume. And just finally, we have been aware that the government was looking at a national environmental standard for water storage. It's been very explicit about its support for increasing reliability and security of water. But from what we could piece together from the various announcements, it seemed that the government was quite focused on the actual construction of those storage facilities, and that's kind of a thing that can be standardised pretty simply across the country. They weren't so much looking at the actual take of water to fill the reservoir. It seemed like that was going to continue to sit with regional councils. So we haven't been looking at the actual construction of storage facilities or anything, and happily, when the National Direction Package came out recently, that was exactly what they were proposing. The NES that they're looking at would manage the construction and use of a reservoir, but it wouldn't cover how much water you can take to fill it in the first place. So it works in really well with what we've been talking about. So I think I'll probably stop there and take any questions.
Neil? Well, just again, a few questions here. Firstly, obviously we have some programs in Taranaki like the Pole Creek and the Waimate West scheme, and there have been people who looked at other similar plans which are not really taking so much from, shall we say, an individual river, but maybe taking from the water coming off the Tonga, something like that. And there may be some backcountry ones that could do the same thing. So I don't know how those kind of schemes fit in. And I do note that we've had concerns expressed, particularly by South Taranaki, with regards to the drought. We've had conversations in the emergency management group committees about that, and I know that the Mayoral Forum has also had discussions about some of those aspects. So I guess it would be really good if actually that, you know, the ideas you've got in general here, but it might be a good idea if we actually could see what you might say as a model solution, because there's also the whole question of where would this water be and what sort of, what would you be allowed to do. I can think of a couple of examples in Taranaki where streams themselves have been turned into lakes, basically, which are used then for irrigation purposes. In the couple of cases I can think of, they're actual streams that go right over the edge of the cliff. So unless you've got flying fish swimming up to the stream, it's not a problem. But have you got any, shall we say, practical examples that, or theoretically what could be a practical example of this? Because, and I know we don't want to get into that today perhaps, but we'd be very interested to see how this might work out in practice rather than in theory.
Yeah, so I think there's two ways that water can be stored. One is by damming the river, you know, and storing water behind the dam. So that's in-stream storage. There's quite a bit of that in Taranaki, and that covers all the flows that go in, whether they're high flow, low flow. You know, the flows just get stored behind the dam, and then people take the water. Quite a few examples of that, and that's not really what we're looking at here. We're looking more at the off-stream storage, where a farmer might have a pond on farm, and so they take water and fill that pond, and then they can just take from that pond whatever they like. There's no restrictions on what to do with it. Fiona, do you want to talk about those examples?
Well, the only really example, Trustpower has the Lake Mingwahoi, so that is obviously an opportunity where they'll use the water. The District Council does take water out of there, and they've got restricted limits on that, and I think that's more to do with the agreement that Trustpower and Manawa Energy had that water there. We don't have any examples of how it would work. We're just trying to find solutions for farmers, especially that want to keep on irrigating that sort of thing, to have opportunities. So I've got a farmer down in South Taranaki that's actually looking at this right now, looking at his current consent that he has.
Speak up a little bit.
There's a consent holder down in South Taranaki at the moment that's got a consent that allows him to take 100 odd litres per day. So he's now looking at utilising that over the winter. So that would be an example of it. But the majority of our farmers currently do use in-stream storage, but we don't want that because then that obviously affects the flow variability. So that's why we're promoting the off-stream. I know district councils are very concerned about it, and NPDC has been looking into it, but we don't have any examples ourselves.
Thank you. Tuhio and then Donna.
Kia ora. Yeah, thank you for the report. Yeah, I guess from an iwi perspective is that we wouldn't really support the, I have to get this right, the median. We'd support the mean because that would allow more water into the awa, into the waterways. But I guess what I can't get my head around is if we have these high flow levels so high and then the primary is still on that mean annual load flow, like it looks like we're just allowing more water to be taken rather than actually reducing the amount of water being taken, which is what the iwi are asking for consistently. So if you could explain that. And the other thing is this, how are we going to actually manage and regulate, what do you call it? Yeah. How are we going to actually control these takes? Because if this is permitted, then this is a lot of data to be collecting to establish what is the mean or median in the first place. And then every time they take, we're going to have a meter, I presume. Like, how's that going to work? Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll take those two questions separately. Yes, you're right that a high flow harvesting regime does allow more water to be taken. I guess the difference is that what we've been looking at in terms of primary allocation, in terms of the minimum flows that would apply in the region, the proposal that went out to the community last year that was supported by most of the community was an increase in the minimum flow compared to what's currently used in the plan. And so there would be more water being left in those rivers, which has an impact on the amount of water that a water user can take as primary allocation. What we're trying to do here is give water users a more sustainable approach, because some of them are going to have to reduce the amount of water that they take in order to comply with new plan provisions. What we're trying to do is offer them a solution where they can harvest at higher flows, which means that they potentially can still take the same amount of water, but they're taking it at a better time of year for the river and reducing the pressure on those rivers at low flow. So from our perspective, although it is allowing people to take more water, it's allowing them to take water in a more sustainable way by working with the way that the rivers operate. And that's why we're also prioritising the off-stream storage. Under the NPS at the moment, it's incredibly difficult to do damming. It would be a tough proposition for anyone to be consenting a dam, I think. And so we really want to be encouraging that off-stream approach, which, like Fiona says, has fewer impacts on the actual water body itself because you're not storing the water in the river and you're not preventing fish passage. But I guess giving farmers and other water users a more sustainable source of water. In terms of the monitoring, this wouldn't be a permitted activity. It's a bit too technical in terms of the actual flows. We really need to be looking at the specific rivers themselves. But it would be setting out it would be clarifying for users how much water is available from rivers and when they can expect that water to be available, i.e. at what flow can they start taking. So it would be a relatively straightforward consent process, presuming that there is enough allocation available for people to take. And there would be requirements to meter those takes so that the council has a clear idea of when water is being taken and can take compliance action if it's being taken outside the parameters set in the plan.
A supplementary question. So you would be having flow meters on those waterways, and also when you're talking, median mean over a certain period, like what period are you looking at? Because when I've looked at take consents, they're using data that's really old and inappropriate now. So
in terms of flow recorders, yes, there would need to be flow recorders so that there's an accurate, so that users can know when they are actually able to take the water. Talk about the data?
In terms of the data, you really for median flows you want 2 or 3 years worth of flow data. So there would probably be a provision within the consent that would require you to have the flows reviewed after 2 or 3 years' time. We would try and use our best estimate and go get a flow. Well, it would be up to the applicant to go and get the information that they need to say this is what the flow is in the river, this is what we think the median flow is, and they'll need to have a robust process to do that. We won't accept anything that's not. That would be my understanding, and then we would expect the flow to site to go in and that will be utilised.
Donna?
Just to clarify that this isn't the basic stock water permitted activity that we've got now. It's a separate issue. It's more about irrigation or something like that.
Yeah, this would certainly be where you really need a lot of water very reliably on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions, Celine?
Yeah, I also don't support the recommendation for using the medium flow. If this goes ahead, I think the mean flow is a better option. Would you ever envisage it being used for municipal water supplies or only agriculture and farming?
No, it could be used for anything.
Yeah.
It would just be up to whether there's whether it's going to be a practical solution.
Appetite for spending $12 million to build another water reservoir to service a small town. Yeah. I think, on that basis, I think this is flawed because I agree with the kaupapa that we need to be reducing water takes, not providing opportunities for people to increase them. And there are several other ways of collecting and storing water, especially for municipal supply. And so I think that, and given the cost involved of creating storage facilities for this sort of collection, I don't see that this policy is necessary, and I won't be supporting it.
Any further comment?
Well, I personally will be supporting it because I think it actually gives people more flexibility to do things. And we're not saying people have to do things, we're just making it permitted that we can look at these situations and grant resource consents or whatever it is necessary to get it done. I think it's always a good idea to keep the doors open rather than to close them at this level.
Alan?
I'm with Neil as well, and I think it's probably the only one that does the least damage to the rivers without taking excessive amounts at the wrong time. So through this method, at least you're not damaging the rivers to the extent that probably has happened in the past. So
we're not actually making a decision
No,
right now.
Just receiving it.
And I also just wonder whether we're actually at cross purposes a little bit.
Yeah.
What I heard Celine saying is she wants to see things like demand management being quite aggressively implemented, things like rainwater tanks for your garden, washing your car, rather than using your town supply. And all of those things we would absolutely support, and indeed are quite likely to require and probably become compulsory to require as part of future water take consents for, particularly for urban drinking water supply. So I think we're actually horses for court, different purposes here, and probably everybody would certainly as an organisation at a staff level support the notion of good demand management for water takes and supply, but the ability to have access to excess water where needed and where justified and where people are prepared to invest in the infrastructure because there's a economic benefit and need for it, that potentially can sit side by side. So just be careful we're not talking about a different end goal in mind here, because I think we are probably aligned on a number of things in there that are
and you're correct, Steve, that we will be coming back with to talk to you more about take and use, which includes existing takes.
Yes.
And yeah, that whole take and use side of things at a later date.
And in fact, some of those issues are quite likely to be driven as national requirements out of Hawaii over time with their engineering standards anyway, so it will become compulsory, and obviously we can change our consenting and policy regime if those things do become mandatory.
One of the other things that I've been always interested around water allocation is how we put like a sinking lid when consents are up and when the allocation demands aren't so great and people don't need them. Are we sinking the lid, which may counterbalance some of the high flow potential activity or whatever? So yeah, rather than being at cross purposes at this point, do we support generally moving ahead with the direction of travel, acknowledging that there's still a lot of work to do? There's work to do with the Hotaio and the space.
The devil's in the detail.
More reporting to come back to the table for our consideration.
I like this process. I'm happy with the process.
That's it well with you, Celine, just to keep the conversation?
Yeah,
moving?
I mean, I'm fully aware that this isn't a final decision. So, and I'm sure my one vote isn't going to affect the outcome of the decision here. So, yeah.
But we're just, yeah, we're keeping the conversation going. Here, koe tuhia?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with most of it. It's just the mean versus the median is where I'm stuck.
So, yeah, there's still work to do, there's still conversations to be had, and for it to come back to us for further consideration. So to that end, we're happy with someone to move the recommendations. Thank you, Alan. Moving the recommendations on page 614, seconder. Thank you, Susan. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Any against? Celine, once
Yeah.
you're... And Tuhiao?
Yeah, sorry.
Your objections noted?
Thanks.
Please, and noting those objections. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Kia ora, the motion is carried. Thank you, team. Thank you, ladies. Nearly there. Okay. The other big meaty agenda item. Thank you for everyone for hanging in there. Really appreciate your endurance. I was going to say indulgence, but endurance today. Reporting back on our proposed dairy effluent management phase out. We turn the time back to the A team on this kaupapa.
I'll hand over to Felicity. She's going to take you through this one again. So,
Benita.
Yes, Kapai.
So, I need to go because I've got another meeting, but can I just note that I'm in support of the recommendations?
Kia ora, can we take that into consideration? Because I think we're going to lose quorum.
Oh, okay.
So we'll lose quorum. Oh, no, Donna's still there.
No,
I'm here. I'm here.
I can sit in two meetings at once. If that's...
No, that's 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 with Donna.
No, lead them counts.
Oh, lead them.
Lead them, there's 7 with Donna.
3, 4,
So we're fine.
7.
I'm hanging in. It's 3 a.m. though.
Okay, yep. Let's move, team. Thank you.
That's all right. I've just got.
Yeah, otherwise she's going to go to sleep. I don't think she counts if she's asleep.
Thank you, Tuhiao.
I'm awake. I'm well awake, Mr. Hughes.
Ngā mihi.
Is it working?
Kapai. Thank you, team.
And look, just an apology, we had some crossed wires and the wrong presentation has ended up in your slide pack. So I'll make sure that the proper one is circulated, but I don't have many slides to talk about. We did a lot of discussion last time on this topic, and this is really just coming back to you with the more information that you'd requested. So first of all, there was quite a lot of discussion about the work that Dairy NZ is doing on the dairy effluent storage calculator, and a real desire from councillors to ensure that we're not getting ahead of that work, which might open up some additional options for farmers who are looking to transition to discharging to land. Under the dairy effluent storage calculator, one of the things that is taken into account is the risk of the soils on a property. And the matrix that is used by the calculator is this one here. And you can see the line between green and red. Green is the low-risk soils, red are the high-risk soils. The main tipping point from going from category D, low risk, into category C is the slope of land. If you've got slopes higher than 7 degrees, then you're just automatically in the high-risk category, even if the soils are still free draining and you would meet some of the other characteristics. So what Dairy NZ is looking at is whether that slope threshold could be changed and raised in some parts of Taranaki where there are still good free draining soils, and infiltration testing demonstrates that the low risk application depths and rates would still result in an appropriate outcome in terms of effluent application, i.e. the plants are still able to take up the nutrients applied through the effluent. So at the moment, we have been working with Dairy NZ and their contractors to outline some criteria for identifying test sites where they will do the soil infiltration testing. And because this has come really at the request of the Upper Ring Plain farmers, we're really looking at, I mean, obviously the slope is going to be a factor for investigation, but looking also at the rainfall, which is another influence on how often you can apply effluent to land and how much storage you need to have. And the other thing that we're looking at is the number of water bodies that a farmer has on their property and what that means.
Amazed how many some people have.
I was too, yeah. 11 water bodies on one property is...
Wow, where do you build your house? Where do the cows go?
And if you have to be set back 25 metres from each of those water bodies, you can end up with a really impractical area to apply your effluent on. So that's the work that's underway at the moment. Dairy NZ had sort of been overtaken by some other priorities and had sort of paused this work, but they are keen to have our involvement, and so things have picked up again, and they are looking to do the soil infiltration testing quite soon. So this work is progressing at a good rate now.
Wasn't it this week? I think they're up here this week.
Yes, I think they are investigating some potential sites for the testing this week. Just a reminder of where the remaining discharges are, because although the Dairy NZ work is looking predominantly at the characteristics that are most common in that upper ring plain area, there are actually still a lot of discharges to water happening outside those areas on some pretty flat land where the rainfall is not especially high. You'll see here that there's a total of 269 consents. Last time I came here, there were 277 consents, which was, the data at that point was a couple of months old, but that's just a reflection of the fact that these consents are continuing to come in and be renewed, and farmers are continuing to transition to discharging to land, even in the absence of a new plan, which is really encouraging. So the number has decreased, which is nice. In terms of the constraints, we talked about slopes and rainfall, and we looked at the number of water bodies. So using the GIS information that we have of location of current consents and information that we have on these environmental parameters, I did some analysis to figure out how many of these properties, these existing discharges, are affected by the different constraints. And you can see that rainfall and waterways, obviously a clear relationship between how much rain falls and how many water bodies you then end up with. And that is the category where the largest number of consents are affected. When you add in the slope element, not so many properties affected by the slope threshold. But when you look at properties that are affected by all three, we're only looking at 15 consents out of that total 269. So quite small number affected by all three, but definitely a reasonable proportion affected by two of those constraints. So last time I came to you, I presented a range of options, and there was some discussion about a halfway house, I guess, between a couple of the options. And so what I've proposed in the paper now was there was some discussion about, there was sort of preferences for no transition, where people just have to transition when their consents expire, versus having a staged transition where some people whose consents are expiring soon get a bit of extra time to transition. And there was some feedback that it would be good to look at an option that combined those two things. So what I've proposed in the paper now is that the assumption is that you must stop when your consent expires, except if your farm meets particular criteria, and that would be the slope, rainfall, waterways that we've been talking about that put those physical constraints on the ability to apply effluent to land. And if you do meet those criteria, then you can get a replacement consent, but it would be relatively short term to give you a bit of extra time to secure the funding needed to upgrade any infrastructure. That would put the end of the phase out at 2037, but that is a worst case scenario. It really depends on when an individual consent expires and the terms of the replacement consent. So happy to take feedback.
Yeah, and I'm happy to give you some. In that I don't think that those factors identified are enough. And for myself, I would want to see anyone who wanted some latitude to be coming with a plan of how they were going to comply. Because it seems to me that there must be some amongst that. I accept that it's a small number, but it feels like there are some who have sat on their hands and are kind of playing it a bit like James's saga about being unable to get the information he wants from the last few percent. This feels like the same group of people. And I don't think it's enough just to come and say, I've got more than 7 degrees, I've got 55 waterways running through my property, my cows are sad, my wife's sadder, give us another 5 years. That must come with a plan.
Sure.
And that plan must be able to be executed within however many years we ultimately identify.
That's certainly something the plan could do.
Mm.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The other question I have is the 5 years proposed in point 40. What was the kind of thinking behind that figure, or was it just arbitrary 5 years that seemed like a good idea?
Well,
Seems too long to me.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you raised that because I was hoping to have some discussion about that time frame. I sort of went backwards and forwards on 3 years versus 5 years.
I prefer 3.
Yep.
I would possibly be interested in some feedback from Donna on that because she probably has a little bit more insight. The other thing is you talked about the timeframes 2037. Can you remind me of what the time, because we had some timeframes in the last meeting report. Can you remember?
So this is where this is where it gets a bit tricky because the timeframe would start when the plan is notified. So there'll be some consents expiring this year ahead of any notification of a plan that would be potentially a replacement granted. And we don't know the terms. What kind of terms do you normally grant?
Oh, yeah, we're doing the 5 years.
5 years.
We are,
yeah. Yeah. So
I mean, that's 12 years away. 2037.
2037.
Just to put things into perspective.
And that's why I said
they're
it's
still putting shit in the streams.
And that's why that would be the worst case scenario.
Yep. Donna?
I was just going to say it's not effluent straight in a stream. It is treated effluent, so that's something. Yeah, but hey, I'm actually for. I think the 3 years rather than 5 as well. But I think we'll get some good technology, and some of these higher rainfall farms will end up with some really good. There'll be, but anyway, I'm happy with the alternative, but I don't think we need to go out to 2037. I did talk to a couple of really high altitude smart farmers, and they felt that they could, like, once we get some solutions around the soil and probably water usage is another big one that affects things. I think they'll come up with some good answers pretty quickly.
If I could just make a suggestion, there was a suggestion to have an additional criteria that you have to come with a plan. You could also have an additional criteria that means that pathway is only available to people with consents expiring before a certain date. So you're only capturing the ones who might be looking at having to transition very quickly.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. Susan, those ones around the bottom, I'm kind of inclined to agree with Donald that they need to move. They've got no constraints and they need to move, but we have had a big lot change, and some will just be waiting for their consents to expire and then they'll do it. So this will just hurry that process up, I guess. But as long as the council can cope with the consents, because if we're going to push this, we'll look stupid if we can't process the consents. Is that a fair comment?
Steve will sort it.
Look, I think it'll take care of itself because they'll have different expiry timeframes. And again, the number, if they keep on decreasing, and there is a bit of, we don't know when our plan will officially get notified, and yes, while we're working to having it, our earliest timeframe is effectively the end of 26 under the current timeframe. But obviously some of that's subject to national government, national policy as well. So, and even then, it'll take time to go through the freshwater panel planning process, etc. So,
And there'll be the scoping of when people are expected to do what at what stages, so the resources can be allocated.
And the numbers will just continue to reduce, if they continue to reduce as consents expire.
Fabulous.
And I would think, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, that processing an application to discharge to land is going to be less complex than processing a discharge to water. It's because it's the thing that you want to see, right? And there are a lot of consents for discharges to land. The team's really, all over that side of things. So they should be less complex consents going forward.
One of the big points here is that if you don't do it right and make people put it onto land, it'll just go through and go into the system. So it's most important that you actually get it right if you can. It's not just as matter of saying, do it now, because you're actually not helping.
But the processing of the consents is BAU anyway. It's only the assessment of the exemptions that will be additional.
Which should be small in number.
Yeah, if I could just comment on that. Yeah, it is. We've had the bulk of them come through. We've had a huge amount over the last couple of years, processing a couple of hundred consents in 1 year for dairy. So we're through the bulk of it. So what we're getting now is basically drips and drabs. Basically what Fonterra are requiring people to shift. We're getting those early renewals. So as far as our team is concerned, we're pretty much on top of this.
Fabulous.
So, yeah.
That's been confirmed in writing.
Document. Thank you, team.
We've all heard that.
Some other comment?
I was just going to say, I think it's great that we as a council are looking at our soils and not, because that calculator is, the DNZ calculator wasn't based on our soils and our region. So I think it's great that we're looking at our region and the soils we have.
Fabulous. So, sounding like we're going to do more work on implementing a criteria set around who qualifies, implementing a reporting system back where they come back with their plans as a part of the process for approval. But generally, we're accepting and very pleased with and very grateful for the direction of travel and the work that's been put into coming back and reporting to us today. Is that a fair summation, team?
Good.
Oh, that must be a yes from you.
Yeah, I just think if we're going to say come back with a plan, that we don't expect a major, if we haven't quite got the answers yet, that we're not expecting someone to come up with an expensive plan. Yeah.
Thank you. So further to that, I'd like to move the last recommendation of the day. On page 633, that we receive the memo and support the direction of travel. May I have a seconder for that?
Happy to.
Thank you, Alan. All in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Any against? That's carried. Thank you all, one and all, it's been a very long day. My eyeballs are dry and scratchy, so.
Closing karakia.
Closing karakia.
And then we've got to sing herself a lullaby.
Hapai. So closing karakia. Kia uru uru mai, aho ora, aho kaha, aho mai. Ki runga, ki raro, ki rato, ki waho, re 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 ho, hai maurere, hai maurere ki o tātou. Again, thinking of our colleagues in their times of bereavement. And all the best to you, Donna. Safe travels.
Yeah, thank you.
There you go.
Bye.